Perfect. Thank you, guys. So let's get started. It is 9 o'clock and we have lots to cover. So hi all and good morning. Welcome to our last regional webinar. So welcome to the Northern California one. My name is Ashley Yee. I'm CalRecycle's SB 1383 Implementation Manager. And before I turn it over to Julia Doloff, who's going to go over logistics of the webinar, I wanted to introduce you all to the folks who will be presenting and are available to respond to any questions. So CalRecycle and HF&H, just wave when I say your name. So from CalRecycle, we have Kyle Pogue, Martine Boswell, Alex Rosado, who are representing Edible Food. We have Scott Beckner, Michelle Dewey, and Kristen Pidcock representing Procurement. We have Kara Morgan representing Collections. We have Julia Doloff also representing Collections and who helped to put together these wonderful webinars. So thank you so much, Julia. It is a lot of logistics and behind the scenes. We also have Alan Elizorio and Tricia Moore who are representing Compliance and Enforcement. We also have Sarah Khalid and Sarah Sanders who will help with the Q&A portion. So thank you so much for that. We think the live Q&A is such a hit, and that's a lot of behind the scenes work also. As you'll notice, we also have Tracy Swanborn from HF&H Consultants. As you guys all know, HF&H helped develop our model tools, the model franchise, model enforcement ordinance, model procurement policy, and model edible food recovery agreement. So big thank you to Tracy. She is a senior manager with HF&H, and she managed actually the development of all 4 of those tools from their end. So now I'll turn it over to Julia to go over logistics.
Thank you so much, Ashley. So I'm going to just pull my screen back up and get that slideshow going again. Okay. All right, so good morning, everyone. Today, each team is going to provide an overview presentation of the regulatory requirements for each specified topic. Afterwards, there will be a Q&A session in which CalRecycle staff will unmute participants to allow you to ask your questions over the webinar. Please use the instructions shown on this slide for the Q&A session. If you're watching via the CalEPA broadcast link, you may email your questions to the SLCP inbox. If you're using the GoToWebinar platform, please type your question into the question pane. Staff will unmute participants in the order that questions come in. Note that you will need to unmute yourself on your end when asked to by CalRecycle staff. And please state your affiliation before asking your question. CalRecycle staff may respond to some questions in writing through the GoToWebinar platform, so please review the question pane for those responses. For those watching via the broadcast, we will verbalize some of these questions and responses for you to hear as well. Questions and comments regarding the merit of the regulations were responded to during the rulemaking period. Therefore, today we will be focusing on questions or clarifications regarding implementation and tools. If we do not get to your question today, we will follow up with you at a later date. Now I will hand it off to Kyle Pogue and Martine Boswell, who are going to cover the Edible Food Recovery Program requirements.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Kyle Pogue, and this is Martine Boswell, and we are Team Edible. We have are largely responsible for the main work from CalRecycle on the edible food recovery regulations that you're going to hear about today. And I just, before I say much more, I want to give a big thanks to Julia for coordinating these meetings and for all the team members providing input and answering questions during these webinars. And I also want to thank those of you that are tuning in today. I see about 160 attendees right now. My rough calculation shows about 1,200 attendees thus far in all the other regional webinars. Someone may have to fact check me on that, but that's quite a few people out there with stakeholders in local government and food recovery organizations and many others that have tuned in to listen to these and participate in these webinars. And additional thanks due to the input that many of you have provided has really formed up what we're seeing now as a really important regulatory package here under 1383, and especially the edible food portion. We want to thank those groups that provided input, and that includes groups like food recovery organizations and services, industry associations, and commercial edible food generators, public health departments, the waste and recycling industry, many other state agencies that have provided input, and local governments for sure. So I recognize some of the names on today's attendee list, and do want to thank you for that input that we received. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to Martine, and she'll walk us through the regulatory requirements, and then we're available for a Q&A. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. In this first presentation, I'm going to be giving a high-level overview of SB 1383's Edible Food Recovery Goal and the regulations that have been developed to help California achieve this goal. As most of you, I'm sure, are aware, SB 1383, California, as part of their larger strategy to combat climate change, included a 20% edible food recovery goal in SB 1383. So what do we mean when we say an edible food recovery goal? This is very important to really understand what this goal is. So as written in the law of SB 1383, that no less than 20% of currently disposed edible food must be recovered for human consumption by 2025. And the law of SB 1383 also specified that CalRecycle needed to adopt regulations intended to help achieve this 20% edible food recovery goal. Now, we get a lot of questions about the edible food recovery goal, so there are a few things I want to clarify. The edible food recovery goal is a statewide goal that California must collectively achieve. It is not a goal for individual food facilities to arrange to have 20% of their surplus edible food be recovered. It is also not a goal for individual jurisdictions to achieve a 20% edible food recovery rate. Again, this is a statewide goal that California must collectively achieve. Now, one other thing that's important to note about the edible food recovery goal, if you compare it to the organic waste disposal reduction targets, I want to bring your attention to the 75% organic waste disposal reduction target. You'll see there that it says 75% reduction in the statewide disposal of organic waste from a 2014 level by 2025. So for the organic waste disposal reduction targets in 1383, a 2014 baseline year was specified. In statute, there was no baseline year specified for the edible food recovery goal. As a result, CalRecycle has the autonomy to determine which year is most appropriate to use as the baseline for measuring progress towards achieving that 20% edible food recovery goal. We most likely will be using data from CalRecycle's 2018 disposal facility-based waste characterization study to help inform how we measure the edible food recovery goal. That study measured the amount of potentially donatable food that's disposed in California each year. Next slide. So the key policies that I'm going to cover in this presentation, you can see on this slide, but I'm actually first going to start by giving an overview of what edible food means in the context of SB 1383, since we have this edible food recovery goal, and you will hear the term edible food a lot throughout this presentation. So it's really important to know what it means and how it's defined in the regulations. I'm then going to talk about the direct requirements that are placed on commercial edible food generators and who those generators are. I'll then discuss the capacity planning requirements. From there, I will discuss the requirements that are placed on jurisdictions, specifically that each jurisdiction will be required to implement a local edible food recovery program. And I'll conclude by talking about food recovery organizations and services, and specifically organizations and services, if they voluntarily choose to participate in SB 1383, I will discuss then the requirements that they would be subject to. Next slide. So what does edible food mean in the context of SB 1383? This is very important because depending on which organization you're speaking with or what report you're reading, edible food could be defined very differently than it's defined in SB 1383. But in the regulations, edible food is defined as food intended for human consumption. So that's very broad, but we also specified in the definition of edible food that nothing in the regulations requires or authorizes the recovery of edible food that does not meet the food safety requirements of the California Retail Food Code. So this is critical. Just because the food is intended for human consumption, that does not necessarily mean that that food is safe to have it be recovered for people to eat. So it has to be intended for human consumption and meet all of the California Retail Food Code's food safety requirements in order for it to be considered edible food. So for example's sake, on this photo we have, or sorry, on this slide we have two photos. The photo on the right, this is just a hypothetical example. We have food that's been out on an unsupervised open buffet line where consumers are able to serve themselves. Most county health departments in California would not allow for that food to be donated after the customer's been able to serve themselves. So what's important about that is that the food obviously is intended for human consumption, but it does not meet all of the California Retail Food Code's food safety requirements. So this would not, in most county health departments or by their standards, be allowable for donation. Compare that, however, to the photo on the left. This is a real photo from, or a real series of photos from one of CalRecycle's food waste prevention and rescue grant recipients. I believe this is an example of the recoveries that they were making from K through 12 schools. And again, for example's sake, we will just say that all of this food is in compliance with Cal Code, so it would be eligible for donation at that point. One other thing that we specified in the definition of edible food is that edible food is not solid waste if it is recovered and not discarded. So this is also very important. This is food. It's not waste. It's a material that is before the bin. So as much as we can make sure that if it is safe to have it be donated or to have it go to help feed people, we need to make sure that it is going to its highest and best use of helping feed people in need. Next slide. So the first policy component that I'm going to discuss today involves commercial edible food generators. These are the entities that will have direct requirements placed on them where they will be required to arrange to have the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed be recovered for human consumption. We've separated the generators into two tiers. The tier 1 commercial edible food generators will be required to begin complying as of January 1st, 2022. The tier 2 generators will have to begin compliance 2 years later, beginning January 1st, 2024. We've separated the generators into two tiers for a couple different reasons. The tier 1 generators, many of them already have food donation programs in place. So this is not going to be new to them. They're already doing it to some level. Compare that, however, to the tier 2 generators where some of these generators maybe have never done any food donation. They're absolutely aware of it, but it might be a new practice for them. So it's a little bit more of a heavy lift. We want to give them additional time to prepare for compliance. But in addition to that, the tier 1 generators often have larger amounts of surplus food available for donation, and they have the types of food available that we currently have food recovery networks in place to be able to recover. So it's a lot of produce, fresh and frozen grocery items, things like that. Compare that to the tier 2 generators. Some of these entities are going to have prepared foods or hot prepared foods and smaller quantities of food available on a routine basis compared to the tier 1 generators. So what we really wanted to ensure is that we're making sure we're giving the tier 2 generators, food recovery organizations and services and jurisdictions an additional 2 years to prepare for all of this, where there's going to be a major influx of food available for food donation, and that we have the infrastructure, the capacity, and food recovery networks in place to be able to safely recover the food. Next slide. So as a review, what are the key requirements for these generators? The major requirement for those generators is that they are required to arrange to have the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed be recovered for human consumption. And they must comply with this requirement through a contract or written agreement, either with a food recovery organization or service that will collect the food directly from the generator, or with a food recovery organization that will accept food that the generator self-hauls to the food recovery organization. So again, the really critical part here is that they have to have the maximum amount of their edible food that would otherwise be disposed be recovered, and they have to do that through a contract or written agreement with a food recovery organization or a food recovery service. Next slide. And CalRecycle with HF&H Consultants and Diversion Strategies developed a model food recovery agreement specifically to assist commercial edible food generators with compliance, but also to help food recovery organizations and services, and really to help jurisdictions as well with implementing their edible food recovery programs, making sure that all of this is implemented successfully. So the model food recovery agreement is a highly customizable tool. It does not have to be used, but it absolutely is available for use if you would like to use it. And really, some of the great things about this agreement are that it's going to assist generators with compliance. It will help to ensure that edible food is recovered in a safe, professional, and reliable manner. It's going to also serve to protect food recovery organizations and services from donation dumping based on the language that's included in the agreement. Can also identify potential food recovery arrangements and cost models, so cost sharing models. What we mean by that is that the agreement includes different options for how the cost of recovering that food could be shared, not just taken on completely by the recovery organization. Again, if you didn't want cost sharing models in your agreement, you would not have to use that. As I mentioned before, it's highly customizable. Next slide. And I apologize, I should have mentioned this on the previous slide. That model food recovery agreement, for anyone who is interested, it can be accessed on CalRecycle's education and outreach webpage. If you scroll down to the bottom of the webpage, you will see the SB 1383 model tools, and the model food recovery agreement is the tool that I'm referring to. So if you click on that, you will be able to access it there. So the next policy component that I'm going to discuss involves edible food recovery capacity planning. Next slide. So before I talk about the capacity planning requirements, I want to first mention why capacity planning is so critical. In California, when these regulations go into effect, we're going to see a lot more food available for food donation or for needing to be recovered. And what we know, just based on our work with our key stakeholders working in food recovery and through our food waste prevention and rescue grant program, is that there is a significant need in some areas throughout the state or for particular food recovery organizations and services where they are hoping to be able to increase capacity. They'd like to be able to rescue more food, but they don't have the capacity to do it. As a result, they have concerns that as there will be direct requirements placed on these commercial edible food generators, there's a chance that these organizations and services throughout the state might not have the capacity to be able to accept all of the food that's going to be available for donation. So as a result, if you don't have capacity, what's going to happen? Most likely that food will end up in the trash. We don't want to see that happen, but the food will eventually be discarded if no one is available or able to recover it. So what we need to do is plan and make sure that we have sufficient capacity to meet the edible food recovery needs in each area throughout the state. So the key requirements for capacity planning. In the regulations, the requirements state that counties, in collaboration with cities, special districts that provide solid waste collection services, and regional agencies located in the county, they are required to, first, estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed by Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators located within the county and jurisdictions within the county. So that's the first requirement. Next slide. Once counties and the jurisdictions within the county know how much edible food is estimated to be disposed by their commercial edible food generators, they will then need to consult with food recovery organizations and services to identify their existing food recovery capacity. They will then also need to identify not just their existing capacity, but if there are any plans for new or expanded food recovery capacity. So once they have those two pieces of information, this is how much edible food is estimated to be disposed by our generators, and this is how much capacity we have currently. They then need to identify, okay, do we have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of food that's estimated to be disposed? And if they do not have sufficient capacity to be able to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed, then they will need to submit an implementation schedule to CalRecycle, documenting their plans for how they will increase edible food recovery capacity. Next slide. So again, as part of the capacity planning process and doing these capacity planning analyses, it's absolutely critical and a requirement in the regulations that counties and jurisdictions within the county are consulting with local food recovery organizations and services. Any food recovery organization or service or other entities that are contacted by the jurisdiction for information about their capacity, they are required to respond to the request within 60 days. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, if the county determines that edible food recovery capacity is needed, so they do not have sufficient capacity to recover the amount of edible food that's estimated to be disposed, then the county must notify any jurisdiction that lacks capacity, and those jurisdictions then are required to submit an implementation schedule to the department and again, consult with local food recovery organizations and services to really determine what do we need to be able to increase capacity and what kind of planning can we do to help ensure that we're able to meet those needs. Next slide. Another major policy component in the edible food recovery regulations involves jurisdictions, and specifically that jurisdictions are required to implement edible food recovery programs. As part of each jurisdiction's edible food recovery program, the jurisdiction will be required to educate commercial edible food generators about the commercial edible food generator requirements that they are subject to. So this is really critical because we need to ensure that these generators know what's required of them and when they are required to comply. They will also be required to increase commercial edible food generators' access to food recovery organizations and services. This is going to be particularly important in areas where there might not be many food recovery organizations and services, like a rural jurisdiction, for example, sometimes has those kinds of challenges or barriers. Jurisdictions will also be required to monitor commercial edible food generators' compliance. This is absolutely critical. This is the enforcement piece to ensure that these generators are in compliance with the edible food recovery requirements that they are subject to. And back to capacity planning, jurisdictions will be required to increase edible food recovery capacity if it is determined that they do not have sufficient capacity to meet their edible food recovery needs. Now, we also included language in this section of the regulations, and it's not a requirement, but rather it's language to help encourage jurisdictions or permissive language to let jurisdictions know that this is an option for them. And the language states that a jurisdiction may, and I emphasize the word may because it's may, it's not shall. A jurisdiction may fund their program through franchise fees, local assessments, or other funding mechanisms. So we recognize that implementing this program will cost money. We want to make sure that jurisdictions are aware that they can use different mechanisms to help cover their implementation costs. So I'd like to bring your attention to the term franchise fees. This is really important because we are starting to see some very unique and creative ways to build funding around food recovery in California. And one of the more innovative things that we've seen more recently is where cities are starting to include food recovery in their franchise agreements, where it is a service that they offer to their commercial accounts, and the commercial accounts can voluntarily choose to participate. But if they participate, typically they're paying a little bit higher rate to participate in the food recovery program. And in addition to partnering, obviously, we're working with the hauler, they partner with a local food recovery organization or several food recovery organizations that then work with those commercial accounts to rescue that food. So that is an option. It's just something to be thinking about. Something that's very important about this is that in addition to that model food recovery agreement, CalRecycle with HF&H Consultants also developed a model franchise agreement. And that model franchise agreement also built in different options if you would like to include food recovery in your franchise agreement. So that is something that's available, does not have to be used, but it can be used. So I just wanted everyone to be aware of that. That model franchise agreement can also be accessed on CalRecycle's education and outreach webpage with the other model tools. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, as part of the jurisdiction edible food recovery program, jurisdictions will be required to educate commercial edible food generators. And in addition to providing that general education about the food recovery program, the generator requirements, and really just saying these are the requirements you're subject to, jurisdictions are also required as part of their education and outreach requirements to develop a list of food recovery organizations and services that are operating within the jurisdiction. That list will need to include the name, address, contact information, collection service area, if applicable, and the types of food accepted by each food recovery organization and service that they include on their list. They will need to update the list annually and maintain that list on their website. Now, something that's important to clarify about the list. We do not specify in the regulations that the jurisdiction needs to develop a list of all food recovery organizations and services operating in the jurisdiction, just that a list is created. So really it's at the discretion of the jurisdiction to determine which food recovery organizations and services are most useful, will be most meaningful to include on their list. It could be 50, it could also be 4 food recovery organizations and services. It's really up to the jurisdiction to determine what organizations are going to really be helping us implement our edible food recovery program and are able to establish contracts and written agreements with commercial edible food generators. So when developing that list, try to think of it in the context of 1383 implementation and how will this help generators most and how will this help our program most. Next slide. Jurisdictions are also required to have an enforcement and inspection program. That goes back to the requirement that jurisdictions must monitor commercial edible food generator compliance. So as part of their enforcement and inspection program, they will need to have inspections to verify that commercial edible food generators they do have a contract or written agreement and that those generators are maintaining records. So I didn't have a chance to cover that in this presentation, but just so everyone is generally aware, the commercial edible food generators are also subject to certain record keeping requirements. And as part of enforcement, the jurisdiction would need to verify that the generator has been maintaining those records. The Tier 1 generators, the inspections will begin of these generators starting 2022, and then the inspections of the Tier 2 generators will begin in 2024. And so that everyone knows, it's possible, if you would like, to combine these inspections with your existing mandatory inspections. So for example, if your health department is already looking at food facilities and inspecting many of these generators that way, there's nothing in SB 1383's regulations that prohibits a jurisdiction from contracting with their local environmental health department to fulfill some or all of these requirements. But just know that the jurisdiction is ultimately responsible for compliance. Next slide. So the final policy component that I'm going to cover in this presentation involves food recovery organizations and services. Any food recovery organization or service that enters into a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator pursuant to SB 1383 will be subject to record keeping and reporting requirements. For record keeping, they will be required to maintain a record of the name, address, and contact information for each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator that they have established a contract or written agreement with pursuant to SB 1383. They will also need to maintain a record of the quantity in pounds of edible food collected from each commercial edible food generator they have a contract or written agreement with, and that's really the pounds recovered per month from each of those generators. In addition to maintaining records, these food recovery organizations and services that have chosen to participate in SB 1383 will also be required to report certain information. I want to say right away that there is no requirement to report donor names. So there's no requirement to report proprietary food donation information. The only reporting requirement for these food recovery organizations and services is that they will be required to report to one jurisdiction, and that is the jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located. So they will report to one jurisdiction, the total pounds collected in the previous calendar year from the Tier 1 and the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators that they have established a contract or written agreement with pursuant to SB 1383. So I'll repeat that again. They're only required to report to one jurisdiction, the jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located, and they're only required to report the total pounds collected in the previous calendar year from the commercial edible food generators that they've established a contract or written agreement with pursuant to SB 1383. And so I say that multiple times because it can get a little complex and we get a lot of questions about it. So if you do have questions, we'd be happy to take those at the end of this presentation. Next slide. So to conclude, I just want to cover some of the key edible food recovery dates. Starting in 2022, jurisdictions will be required to establish edible food recovery programs. The Tier 1 commercial edible food generators must be in compliance. Jurisdictions will begin their food recovery capacity planning analyses. Jurisdictions will also begin to conduct their education and outreach, and they will do that on an annual basis. And jurisdictions will also begin their inspections of the Tier 1 commercial edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services that are participating in SB 1383. Beginning in 2024, the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators must be in compliance. Jurisdictions will begin their inspections of the Tier 2 commercial edible food generators, and jurisdictions will be able to take enforcement action against non-compliant entities. Next slide. So that concludes the edible food recovery presentation this morning. Thank you so much for your time, and we'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Kyle and Martine. So this is Julia, and I'm just going to give a quick reminder of how the Q&A session will go. So to ask a question, if you're watching via the CaliPay broadcast, please email your question to the SLCP inbox. If you're logged in via the GoToWebinar platform, just use the question pane. We will unmute participants in the order that questions came in, and a reminder, you will have to unmute yourself on your end when asked to do so. Again, we will respond to questions or clarification regarding implementation and tools only. And just a quick reminder that if we have already responded in writing to your question in the questions pane via GoToWebinar, we will still ask you to ask your question out loud again, and we will respond again verbally. So everyone watching via the broadcast is able to hear the question and response. So don't be startled if we do ask you to ask your question again. So with that, I will hand it over to our question and answer helpers. We have our CalRecycle staff members, Sarah Khaled and Sarah Sanders, who are helping out. So I will pass it over to them.
Thank you, Julia. Our first couple questions are from Hillary. Hillary, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask the couple questions that you had.
Hi, this is Hillary from the city of La Mesa. I'm joining the NorCal one because I missed the Southern California one. I had a bunch of questions and I don't, I'm trying to remember which ones they were. I guess my first one was that language that you mentioned at the beginning on how if they volunteer to participate in 1383. I was just asking for more clarification on what you meant by that language, volunteer, because I thought this was mandatory for these tier 1 and tier 2 commercial generators to participate.
Yeah, Hillary. Did you have anything else to add, Hillary?
No, that one's like the main one.
Hey,
Okay,
Martine.
thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, Hillary, thank you for your question. I was over here typing away trying to answer many of these questions in the chat feature. So I'll tell you what I did say on that one, and please add to this. And Hillary, it was a good question. Not completely sure I was clear on what you meant by it, but you were correct. Tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generators, as they're defined in the regulations that and meet those thresholds also that are defined there, are required to participate in SB 1383. So you were correct when you identified that. I went on to mention, I think that food recovery organizations can choose to participate in this or not. And I think Martine covered that probably after you asked the question a little bit. So hopefully that helps answer your question. But Martine, if you have other thoughts, please chime in.
Yeah, so this, I was a little surprised because in these regional trainings, people really were asking a lot of questions about this. But it's very important that everyone is aware that 1383 is absolutely mandatory for commercial edible food generators for jurisdictions. They have direct requirements on them. They absolutely have to comply with these requirements. We specify, however, for food recovery organizations and services that any food recovery organization or service that enters into a contract or establishes a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator is subject to certain record keeping and reporting requirements. So if they do not enter into a contract or written agreement with a commercial edible food generator, they aren't subject to the record keeping or reporting requirements. And SB 1383 does not require a food recovery organization or service to enter into these contracts or written agreements. So for example, if a food recovery organization did not have the resources or the capacity to be able to enter into a certain contract or agreement with a generator that asks them, hey, we'd like to establish this agreement with you, there's nothing requiring that food recovery organization to enter into that agreement. If they don't have the resources, they don't have to do it. But if they voluntarily choose to enter into that agreement, then at that point, they are subject to SB 1383's record keeping and reporting requirements. So I think for me, the really important lesson is that using the term voluntarily choose to participate has confused people. For food recovery organizations and services, it really is something that they can choose to participate in. But once they do, they're subject to the requirements. For everyone else, it is absolutely mandatory that they participate, that they comply with these requirements.
Thank you. I'm just going to read Hillary's other question that she had. If food recovery organizations opt not to participate, if they do not want to receive food from these generators, then would the food generator be fined for not being in compliance?
So it's the responsibility of the generator to find a food recovery organization or service or multiple food recovery organizations and services that are willing and able to rescue the amount of edible food that they have available for food recovery. So if the generator goes to a food recovery organization and that food recovery organization says, we'll enter into an agreement with you, but we can only take this kind of food. The direct requirement on the generator is that they need to arrange to have the maximum amount of their edible food be recovered for human consumption. So if that food recovery organization, we'll just say, for example, can only take your produce, but you have a bunch of other different types of food, it's their responsibility to establish a second agreement or multiple other agreements so that they would be able to have the maximum amount of their edible food be recovered. So it's really that it's on the generator to make sure that they are in compliance. They're responsible for their own compliance, if that makes sense.
Martina, I just add one thought in there, and I think you discussed this a little bit in your presentation, that we do recognize that there's a variety of food recovery organizations out there that are equipped to accept certain types of foods, right? And they may not want to accept or be capable of accepting prepared foods, for example. They may not have ramped up to that yet. Many of them may want to, or many of them may not want to participate in prepared foods and want to deal more in shelf stable or packaged foods. So just recognizing that there's a diversity of that, we didn't want to tie the hands of those organizations to have to accept foods that they didn't want to. And that goes for a lot of other points that have been made during our workshops about avoiding donation dumping and things like that as well. So just adding that. Thanks.
Our next question is from Tracy. Tracy, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself and state your affiliation. I will go ahead and ask her question. It is, if a restaurant is a buffet style eatery, it does not qualify as a tier 2, correct?
The answer is that it really depends. So the regulations specify a definition for restaurant. So if that buffet meets the restaurant definition, then at that point, they would also need to look at the threshold that was established for restaurants. So in the regulations, under the definition of a tier 2 commercial edible food generator, it will list out each of the generators and it will say if there's a threshold. So the threshold for restaurants is a restaurant with a total facility size of 5,000 or more square feet or 250 or more seats. If that buffet met the restaurant definition and that threshold, then they would be subject to these requirements. But the key there also is that it's a buffet style restaurant. So then at that point, you would need to look at, they would be responsible for compliance, but they would also need to look at how much of our food is really safe for donation. If it's been out on that unsupervised open buffet line, depending on the county that they're in, it might not be safe for that food to be donated. But it could be that they have food that is back of the house that could potentially be donated. So if they met that definition and threshold, the answer is that they would be subject to the regulations, but they would need to be very careful about making sure that they're only donating food that can safely be recovered.
Thank you so much.
So this is Julia. I'm going to read a question that came in through the SLCP inbox. This is from Dana Lawrence with the City of Turlock. Dana's question is, so jurisdictions are just the middleman for this, right? We have a sample agreement model tool and provide it to the generator to set up and arrange with the food recovery agency. And that's a question. So jurisdictions are just responsible for educating the generators on what they need to do, but ultimately it is up to them to set up the agreement and deliver it or arrange for it to be picked up by the secondhand organization.
The short answer is yes. The jurisdiction is not responsible for facilitating these contracts and written agreements and making sure that the generator, that they've established their agreement, that they're helping them do that. That's not the requirement. The jurisdictions are responsible for implementing their edible food recovery program. And so part of that is educating generators, creating that list of food recovery organizations and services, monitoring generators' compliance, increasing capacity. So you're doing that capacity planning analysis as well, and increasing capacity if capacity is needed. But it's the responsibility of the generator, just like you said, to make sure that they're establishing that contract or written agreement. Now, the jurisdiction can help play a role by, saying there's this model agreement that you can use, but it's really the responsibility of the generator to take that step and make sure that they themselves are in compliance with that requirement to establish the contract or written agreement.
Okay, our next question is from Hillary. What are examples on how to increase access to food recovery organizations? How will food recovery agencies either expand their territory, or how will new recovery organizations appear? And Hillary, please unmute yourself if you would like to add more.
Yeah, and I saw the answer that was included about the grant, but that only comes around so often and there's only so much money available. So how can you ensure that your region is able to expand capacity if there's limited funding? And if you're asking all these generators to have these agreements and recover at the maximum, but there's no one that will take it, like I am concerned about throwing food away, but then also worrying that they are going to be concerned about being in compliance if no one can take it.
Yes, so, or Kyle, do you want to first add?
No, Martina, I responded just so you all know, for a little context, I responded with the idea that our Food Waste Prevention and Rescue Grant Program through the California Climate Investment Cap and Trade Funding has helped expand a number of programs, food recovery organizations, programs, their reach, and the amounts and types of food that they're able to accept. And Hillary, fully appreciate that does only come around periodically. We're not guaranteed that funding. So recognize that other funding is going to have to step up and help support that infrastructure expansion a little bit. And I know Martine covered it in her presentation here, that there is language in our regulations here that is permissive, that does not require jurisdictions to provide that funding, but capacity does need to be expanded, or may need to be expanded in certain areas. And with that, there's going to be most likely going to be funding that's needed to help expand that infrastructure. So Martine, add to that anything.
Yeah, so that requirement was written broadly for a reason. And that was really because we didn't want to say specifically how you're supposed to do it, but we wanted to give jurisdictions the autonomy to determine this is how we think we can increase generators' access to these organizations. And that could be something as simple as our generators just simply are not aware of food recovery organizations and services that are in our area. So how can we educate them and help them locate these organizations, or help them establish these contracts or written agreements? And that can be done by providing them with all the information that they would need to be able to contact that organization or service to establish that contract or written agreement. And so really educating them is a critical component of that, but you can do many other things as well and take it a step further. So that goes back to capacity planning. So if you're determining that maybe you don't have sufficient capacity to meet your edible food recovery needs, jurisdictions are going to have to get creative, thinking about what steps are we going to take to increase capacity. Let's consult with our food recovery organizations and services and see what they think. You can also start by consulting with food recovery organizations and services and ask them, how do you think we can increase access to these generators so that they are able to work with you or to work with others? What do we need to do? So there really needs to be that open communication, and it will be a process. It will be something that develops and evolves over time, but certainly this is really up to the jurisdiction to determine what is going to be most ideal for how we can increase these generators' access to organizations to help facilitate safe surplus food donation and really make sure that our food recovery programs are implemented successfully.
Our next question is from Jennifer. It is, how are jurisdictions identifying tier 1 edible food generators? Can you provide an example of how they are getting that information? Is it self-reporting of grocery stores, for example, with the square foot size, or state-determined business type based on some database? Jennifer, you are now unmuted in case you wanted to add anything to that question.
No, I think the only thing I wanted to add was, obviously with jurisdictional budgeting, we are trying to determine how many inspectors we need to ensure those tier 1 edible food generators are inspected. And with that, we need to know obviously how many we have to do that. So I know CalRecycle is looking to develop their tool. We are very eager to understand the tools that you might be able to provide.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. I'm going to invite Kara Morgan if she is available, because she's really the expert on this, and her team has been working on that tool.
Thanks, Martine. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for the question. You know, I really appreciate the urgency for your budgetary planning. So, you know, we do expect the guidance to come out within the next couple weeks. We're so close. Following the guidance being out, we will hold a webinar. But with that said, Jennifer, if you want to set up a call and we could talk about some specific scenarios you have, happy to do so. Feel free to follow up with Jill Ferch and we'll get something set up.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question is from Andrew. Can you clarify if both cities and counties are subject to these jurisdictional requirements? Will counties be taking the lead on all these requirements?
No, and for this question, I think I would feel more comfortable if either Ashley, Yee, or Kara took the lead on responding to this one. Thank you, Kara.
Sure, and you know, Kyle also provided a response in the Q&A. So actually, the answer is both cities, counties, and all jurisdictions that are located within the county are responsible for this planning. The regulations lay out the county being the lead of this collaborative planning effort, and the reason for that is it's really, we find that by collaborating together, you can be efficient in your approach to whether it's edible food capacity planning or organic waste capacity planning. And we have been holding training workshops with counties and their jurisdictions across the state. And if we haven't reached your county, please let your local assistance market development liaison know, and we'll get that scheduled. In those trainings, we lay out how the county can collaborate with the jurisdictions and put together basically a timeline and work plan to share in the responsibilities and outline the tasks that are needed to be completed. The county ultimately is responsible for submitting the report to CalRecycle, and that first report is due August 1. 2022. As a result of edible food capacity planning, as Martine said in her presentation, if there is not sufficient capacity that's either existing, new, or planned that has been identified, then that jurisdiction will also be required to submit an implementation schedule within 120 days of the county submitting its report to CalRecycle. And that implementation schedule really lays out the plan for that individual jurisdiction on how it is going to expand capacity, and that will include how it's going to fund that expansion. I think with edible food capacity planning, we are seeing that more and more counties are needing to do this on a regional basis because so much of edible food crosses boundaries. And so again, we really emphasize the importance of collaboration in this effort. I hope that answered your question, Andrew.
Kara, I'm going to chime in really quickly also. So Andrew doesn't have a mic, so Andrew, please let us know if we answered. But I can't tell where Martine was in her presentation that you asked the question, so I'm not sure if it's completely on capacity planning or if it's just the regulations in general. But as Kyle put in his response that yes, all defined jurisdictions must participate in the regulations. So that I hope answers your your first questions about jurisdiction requirements. So just wanted to clarify, Kara was talking about capacity planning and the collaboration, but Kyle's talking about all jurisdictions needing to follow the regulations. So just wanted to make that clear as well. So thank you.
Our next question is from Hillary. How are the food generators going to purchase scales and make sure they have staff to gather that data? Hillary, you are unmuted in case you wanted to add anything to that question.
Hillary, I like your questions. So the answer is that a generator, if they want to purchase a scale, they can purchase the scale and weigh that food, but typically that's not how it actually works. Usually when a business is donating food to a food recovery organization or service, what that organization or service does is provides them with a receipt of donation. And they're tracking the pounds that have been recovered. So they're going to provide that donor with a receipt of donation and the pounds that have been donated. And that's actually information that's required in order for that donor to receive or to claim the federal enhanced tax deduction for food donation. So a lot of them are tracking that already, and that's something that the food recovery organization is going to give them. Now, it doesn't have to play out that way, but that's typically what we've seen traditionally. Something that we included in that model food recovery agreement are different options specifying how the total pounds of edible food recovered is going to be tracked and who's going to be providing that receipt of donation. So there are different options for whether or not it's the food recovery organization or the generator tracking it. But as I mentioned before, it's typically the recovery organization that already has that equipment to be able to weigh the food and provide that information back to the generator. That is something that could all be specified in the contract or written agreement. But CalRecycle in the regulations, we do not specify who needs to do that tracking. It's just that the generator has to maintain a record of it. So I would strongly urge generators to speak with the food recovery organizations that they work with to see if it's possible for those organizations to provide them with that information.
Thanks, Martine. And this is Julia. We did get a request to go back to the tier 1 and tier 2 commercial edible food generator slide. So I'm going to do that just so it's on the screen for folks. So just wanted to let you know, and then I'll hand it back to Sarah and Sarah. Thanks.
Okay, our next question is from Benjamin. Benjamin, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question. Okay, Benjamin's question is, recover max amount of edible food that would otherwise be disposed. How is maximum defined?
The regulations do not define maximum. In our policy documents, I believe if we were to receive a question about that, we would say the common dictionary definition of maximum is, so that we do have a common understanding of what maximum is. For enforcement purposes, what an inspection official would really be looking for is, it would be difficult to verify that absolutely this is the maximum amount that's been donated. But what they could potentially see is a red flag for where it's highly likely they're not donating the maximum amount. So for example, if I'm an inspection officer and I go to a supermarket and I ask to see the generator's record of their compliance with SB 1383, that record would show me a few things. It would tell me the name of the organization or service that they're working with, the established frequency that the food is collected for food donation, and the types of food that are being recovered and the total pounds collected per month. So what I would look for if you're a supermarket is just making sure that there aren't any red flags. You know, I'm seeing that you're donating produce, non-perishable, prepared foods, things like that, fresh and frozen grocery. Okay, that's good. But if I see that your grocery store and in the past 7 months you've donated 15 pounds or that you've only donated 100 pounds, these are questions that then you would ask to make sure, are you donating the maximum amount? And you might also, as a jurisdiction, just based on my experience of working with food recovery organizations, it's possible because these organizations are often saying, you know, we've been working with this donor and we know that they have more food that could be recovered and we're able to recover it, but they won't donate it. So it is very likely that you could be hearing from recovery organizations as well, saying we're trying to work with them to get more of their food, but they, you know, they have concerns or whatever it may be. But that's really what you'd be looking for, is a red flag to indicate they're probably not donating the maximum amount. And at that point, you would ask more questions to really determine if that was the case. And one other thing that's really critical about that, the reason why we included that maximum amount language, that was not just something we threw in there. The only other government in the world to ever implement an edible food recovery law was France, where they required supermarkets above a certain size to donate their surplus food. We had a food waste expert from France looking at our regulations in depth and commenting on them and helping us to address any loopholes that she saw in the French law to make sure that we did not fall into those same issues. What she said is that the primary problem with the French law was that they did not specify any minimum amount of food that needed to be donated. So as a result, a supermarket could, in theory, donate 1% or 1 apple per year, and they would be in compliance. So per her recommendation and recommendations from our other key food recovery stakeholders, they strongly urged us to include that maximum amount language in the regulations. And so that was a direct result of trying to address something that we saw in the French law that was an issue, to make sure that that did not happen with SB 1383.
Perfect. Thanks, Kyle and Martine. So I'm going to have to transition over to procurement since it is a little bit past 10 o'clock, but Kyle and Martine are available for about 30 minutes right now to answer any questions that are in the chat feature. So thank you again, Martine and Kyle, for the presentation. Just some quick notes. I've been looking through the questions. As a reminder, we are recording this, so if you showed up late or want to re-watch this, we will post it online, but we do have to make it ADA compliant first, so please bear with us. Please sign up for our listserv, as that's how we notify folks. I did see a question about capacity planning and identifying tier 1, tier 2s. We are releasing guidance on how to do some capacity planning, as well as the tier 1, tier 2, identifying them. So again, please sign up for the listserv for that. And with that, Michelle, I will let you take it away for procurement.
Awesome. Thank you, Ashley. And thank you everyone for joining in today for our last regional webinar. It's a pleasure being here. Today, I will be giving you a brief overview of the procurement requirements outlined in the SB 1383 regulations. We did want to leave the bulk of today's session open for Q&A, so this slideshow is a bit condensed, but if you need further information on the procurement requirements, please feel free to check out our webpage, contact us with any questions, and of course, ask your questions during today's Q&A. The procurement requirements are designed to help build the markets for products coming out of organics recycling facilities and to help close the loop on recovering and actually using the organic waste that will be diverted as a result of SB 1383. Today, I'll discuss 2 distinct procurement requirements for jurisdictions: to procure recovered organic waste products and recycled content paper. First, we'll talk about recovered organic waste products. These are shown here and include mulch, compost, energy products from anaerobic digestion, including transportation fuel, electricity or gas used for heating, and electricity from biomass conversion. The regulations do outline specific details as to what makes these specific products eligible for procurement. So I do encourage you to take a look at that text. But the key is that these products are made from California landfill diverted organic waste and that they are made at specific types of facilities or operations defined in the regulations. Jurisdictions are required to undertake this procurement, and for recovered organic waste products, jurisdictions are defined as cities, counties, or cities and counties. So how much of these products does each city and county need to procure? CalRecycle will assign an annual procurement target to each jurisdiction based on their population. The formula you see here is from our regulations and demonstrates how a jurisdiction's procurement target is calculated and how conversion factors are then used to convert this target into quantities of end products. First, a jurisdiction's population is multiplied by a per capita procurement factor of 0.08 tons of organic waste per person, which is defined in the regs, and this results in the jurisdiction's procurement target measured in tons of organic waste. Every 5 years, this procurement target will be recalculated to account for changes in a jurisdiction's population. The regulations then outline conversion factors that are then used to convert each jurisdiction's procurement target into actual quantities of recovered organic waste products. So to determine the end quantity that a jurisdiction would need to procure, the procurement target is multiplied by these conversion factors. We built in multiple options into the procurement requirements to help provide jurisdictions flexibility in meeting their procurement targets. And in keeping with this theme, jurisdictions can customize their procurement and can choose what mix of products they'd like to procure to meet this target. So they can meet their target entirely through one product or through a mix of products. This slide further highlights additional procurement options that were built into the regulations. First, jurisdictions can meet their target either through direct procurement, in which the jurisdiction is directly procuring and using the product themselves or giving it away, or they can meet their target through a direct service provider. In this situation, a jurisdiction could have a written contract or agreement with an entity such as a hauler or a contractor to procure these eligible products on their behalf. An example of this could be as if a city contracted with a landscaping company to use eligible mulch or compost products and requires in that contract that these products meet the regulatory requirements and that they're being procured on behalf of the city. This could count towards the city's procurement target. An important thing to emphasize is that procurement does not necessarily mean purchase. A jurisdiction that produces its own eligible products or receives it in another way, such as free delivery of compost from a contracted hauler, and then uses this product could count this towards their target. It's also important to note that procurement can be what we call a paper transaction. So the products that are actually procured by the jurisdiction do not have to be produced within their jurisdiction, made from their own collected organic waste, or even used within their jurisdiction. So a jurisdiction, for example, could purchase eligible compost from anywhere in the state and use this towards its target. Lastly, CalRecycle has built a mechanism into the regulations where a jurisdiction's procurement target can be lowered to ensure that a jurisdiction is not procuring more recovered organic waste products than it can use. This was included because the intent of these requirements is not to force jurisdictions to buy more or procure more than they have a need for. A jurisdiction may qualify for an adjusted procurement target if their calculated target exceeds their previous year's procurement of energy products. So this would be their previous year's procurement of fuel, electricity, or gas used for heating. This mechanism is triggered by a jurisdiction as part of their annual report, and jurisdictions must keep records and report to CalRecycle that previous year's quantity of energy products to support the use of a reduced procurement target. This slide shows just a few examples of how a jurisdiction might choose to use these products to meet their goal. Compost or mulch may be used for things such as erosion control measures, as a soil amendment or cover in parks or open spaces. A city or county could also host giveaways, and this can count towards their procurement target. A jurisdiction may choose to use transportation fuel from renewable gas to fuel things such as their own buses or waste fleets, but they may also have a contracted direct service provider relationship for an external entity, such as their franchise waste hauler, to procure on their behalf and use this eligible fuel in their own trucks. A jurisdiction could use renewable gas used for any heating needs, such as on-site needs of heating and cooking, or to heat equipment such as the digesters themselves. And electricity generated from biomass conversion or from renewable gas from anaerobic digestion may be used to power any needs, such as on-site at the organics recycling facility itself, or really any other buildings or infrastructure used by the jurisdiction or their direct service providers. Jurisdictions are required to maintain records so that CalRecycle can verify compliance as needed. These records and requirements are outlined in the regulations, but they include things such as the name, physical location, and contact information of the entities from whom products were procured, a general description of how products were used, and invoices or other records describing procurement for both direct procurement by the jurisdiction and through their direct service providers. And please note there are additional record-keeping requirements outlined in the regulations specified for certain products, including mulch and energy products from wastewater treatment facilities or from biomass conversion. So do take a look at that language. The second part of the procurement requirements are for the procurement of recycled content paper. And these are entirely separate from the recovered organic waste product requirements we've discussed so far. Unlike the requirements discussed so far, the requirements for recycled content paper procurement is a blanket requirement for all paper purchases. So there is no target of how much needs to be purchased. Rather, all purchases must meet these requirements. Another important distinction is that these requirements do include a broader scope of jurisdictions that are subject to these requirements. So it's not just cities, counties, or cities and counties included in the definition of jurisdiction who need to comply with these, but also special districts that provide solid waste collection services. SB 1383 builds upon existing requirements which many local public entities already meet, such as to purchase minimum recycled content paper products. However, there are a few new requirements added. One is that paper purchases must be recyclable as defined in the Federal Trade Commission guidance. This means that a substantial majority of the population where these products are sold have access to recycling programs for the product at the end of its useful life. Another requirement added through SB 1383 is that jurisdictions must require the vendors from whom they procure these paper products to provide certifications of that minimum post-consumer content and that these products are recyclable. And there are a variety of paper products and printing and writing paper products included in the regulatory definitions. So do take a look at that, but it includes a wide range of products, including paper janitorial supplies, cartons, packaging, file folders, envelopes, and most printing and writing paper. There are also record-keeping requirements for the recycled content paper procurement requirements, and these include copies of invoices, receipts, or other proofs of purchase that describes the procurement, and those copies of certifications or other verifications from those vendors documenting the minimum post-consumer recycled content and that these products are recyclable. This slide gives a timeline for SB 1383 implementation. The procurement requirements and key dates for procurement are highlighted here in red. And these requirements do become enforceable, as you see on our slide, in 2022 with the rest of the regulations. Rural counties and jurisdictions located within rural counties that are exempt from the organic waste collection requirements will not be required to comply with the recovered organic waste product procurement requirements until January of 2027. So there is one delay in implementation for those entities. However, all types of jurisdictions, including rural jurisdictions, will be required to comply with the recycled content paper procurement requirements in 2022. Jurisdictions will be informed annually of their procurement targets through posting on CalRecycle's website and through direct written notification. However, jurisdictions can certainly calculate their procurement targets now using the formula outlined in the regulations. It is important to note, however, that official procurement targets for the year of 2022 will be taking into account newer population data than is currently available. We expect this data to be available in May of this year, and CalRecycle will be providing notes to jurisdictions of their official targets following the release of this data, so stay tuned. And as mentioned earlier in our presentation, that procurement target for each jurisdiction will be recalculated every 5 years to account for changes in a jurisdiction's population. So the procurement target for the year of 2022 will be in effect for 5 years until 2027. There are requirements also included in Article 13 of the regulations for jurisdictions to report annually to CalRecycle to demonstrate their compliance with the SB 1383 regulations. If jurisdictions are procuring mulch to count towards their annual procurement target, there is a one-time initial compliance report due in April of 2022, and this is the only instance of reporting outside of the annual reports. And this requirement for the initial compliance report is if a jurisdiction is procuring mulch, they'll need to report to CalRecycle a copy of their ordinance or other enforceable mechanism adopted, outlining that the mulch procured meets a variety of requirements outlined in the regulations. However, all other reporting will take place through the annual reporting on the dates shown here. And this reporting will include the amount of each recovered organic waste product procured during the previous calendar year. And if a jurisdiction is implementing a reduced procurement target, they'll also need to report those quantities of energy products procured in the calendar year prior to support that reduced target. Lastly, this slide highlights some of the tools and resources that are currently available to help jurisdictions implement the procurement requirements. The procurement calculator tool was developed by CalRecycle and released on our website a few months back, so it's available now. And it can be used by jurisdictions to calculate their procurement target and the quantities of recovered organic waste products they'll need to procure to meet this target. It can help jurisdictions in planning for their procurement and in tracking their progress towards meeting their target. We hosted a webinar on this tool in February, webinar training. However, it was recorded in case you missed it, and it will be posted on our website hopefully very soon. It's in its final stages of compliance review. So stay tuned. If you are signed up through our SLCP listserv, this is where we will announce when this is posted online for your viewing. We also have a model procurement policy that was developed with HF&H, which is a customizable template that jurisdictions may use if they are planning to develop and adopt a procurement policy. And it can be customized to reflect specific types of products a jurisdiction plans to procure and how a jurisdiction will carry out this policy. So it's a great tool and template out there available. And we also have case studies on procurement that highlight what some jurisdictions' actions they're already taking towards compliance on our website, and additional resources and guidance in development underway. So please do stay tuned, and we're in the works of developing more. And please let us know if there's any resources you'd like to see highlighted on our website as well. So that's it for my presentation today. Please be sure you are signed up to our SLCP listserv to stay up to date on all developments. This presentation was a fairly quick overview, but if you need further information, we're looking forward to your questions today. And of course, check out our website resources. Thank you so much for listening in. We're really excited to have this opportunity today to hear from our Northern California stakeholders. I'm sure there will be a number of out-of-the-box scenarios and questions with a lot of nuance that we potentially haven't considered. So some of these we may need to take offline and get back to you at a later date, but we will be sure to follow up and get more details and get those questions answered. And as mentioned previously for today's Q&A session, we won't be addressing the merits or reasoning behind the language that was developed in the regulations, as we really want to use this time to focus on our implementation and clarification questions. And before we open up the floor, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Kristen Pidcock, to touch on a number of our most frequently asked questions we regularly address, which will hopefully address some of your questions off the bat and hopefully guide some of your questions and discussion today for our Q&A. So please take it away, Kristen.
Thank you, Michelle. Great presentation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kristen Pidcock. I am with CalRecycle. As Michelle said, we are really looking forward to this opportunity to hear your thoughts and your questions today. We're really hoping these sessions have been helpful for you. So I am going to touch on a couple of commonly asked questions that we receive about procurement. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. I don't have a slideshow, but the first question is, how can a jurisdiction meet their procurement target So for example, if a jurisdiction has organic waste that they're sending to a compost facility, does that count as procurement? So the regulations do outline that procurement is achieved through the end use or giveaway of recovered organic waste products. So simply diverting your organic waste to a compost facility, it doesn't meet the procurement requirements. So the intent of procurement is to encourage that demand and use of products, which helps close the loop, and because this is where we see the most environmental benefits. So how these end products are being used is really the focus of procurement. The next question we often get is also regarding what can count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target when there is an entity in a jurisdiction that is using recovered organic waste products. So for example, if there's a local waste hauler and they're fueling their trucks with eligible transportation fuel that's derived from renewable gas, can that count towards their procurement target? So in that situation, it could be eligible, but there would need to be that established direct service provider relationship for that to count and be an option. Michelle had touched on this just a little bit in her presentation. So this means there would need to be a written agreement or a contract in place between the jurisdiction and the end user defining the direct service provider relationship and how they would be procuring on the jurisdiction's behalf. So if there isn't that written agreement and relationship established, then the external entity isn't considered part of the jurisdiction, so they wouldn't, what they're doing wouldn't count towards their jurisdiction's procurement target. Our third question is, in what circumstances does mulch count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target? And mulch is eligible as a procurement product if it meets those requirements outlined in the regulations. So among other things, the mulch must be produced at specific permitted facilities, and it also has to comply with the land application standards. And the requirement for it to be produced at these permitted facilities is to ensure that these products are in fact being made from diverted solid waste, as well as helping support the landfill diversion goals of SB 1383. So you may notice chipping and grinding operations, for example, those are excluded. And that's because the feedstocks typically entering those types of facilities are not considered landfill diverted materials. And my last question here is, under what circumstances can gas produced at a POTW or publicly owned wastewater treatment facility count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target? And there are several requirements outlined in regs, but the key to remember is that the renewable gas must be produced from diverted organic wastes. So the water treatment, the wastewater treatment facility would need to be accepting eligible diverted organics from specific permitted solid waste facilities. And then that portion of the gas that's produced from those diverted organics is what may count towards the jurisdiction's procurement target. So those are the questions I have just to get us started and to get you thinking. We're going to go ahead and transition into our open Q&A session. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for listening, and I'm going to hand it back over to Julie to get us started.
Thank you so much, Michelle and Kristen, for your wonderful presentations. So this is just a reminder to please use the instructions shown on this slide for our Q&A session. With that, I will hand it over to Sarah and Sarah to help facilitate this session.
Thank you, Julia. Our first question is from April. April, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm April Pay. I'm with Placer County, and my question has to do with our procurement targets. Obviously, we have incorporated cities within our boundaries, and but the county offices only serve constituents in the unincorporated areas. So my question is simple, I hope, and that is will our target be based on the constituents that we serve, because the cities are responsible for their own residents?
Good morning, April. Thanks for your question. The procurement targets are based off of populations as reported by the California Department of Finance. So they report county populations and city populations separately. So those cities within your boundary will have separate procurement targets that are not included in yours. But your procurement target will be the county population as reported by the Department of Finance. But yes, not including those cities.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Oh, and Scott, I think you're a little quiet.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Is that better?
For me, you are.
Better?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Our next question is from Xavier. Xavier, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation. Xavier's question is, what qualifies as eligible mulch or compost?
Thanks for your question, Xavier. So I would encourage you to take a look at the regulatory text, which does have some pretty specific language outlined. But for compost and mulch, some of the key requirements that you'll want to ensure you look at to ensure the products you're considering are eligible. The compost and mulch, there are specific types of facilities from which these need to be produced and procured in order to count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target. So for example, compost, in the regulatory text, it outlines that it needs to be produced at either a compostable material handling facility or operation, or a in-vessel digestion facility that is composting on site. And for mulch, there are also some different facility types outlined, and those include a transfer processing facility or operation, a solid waste landfill, or that composting facility or operation again. And for mulch, there also is a requirement, I noted briefly in the presentation, that a jurisdiction needs to adopt an enforceable ordinance or other enforceable mechanism adopted that requires that mulch meet some of these requirements and land application requirements for public health safety. So do take a look at that, and hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, our next question is from Zin C. If you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please. Okay, their question was, is the reduced procurement target limited to energy products? If a jurisdiction has no outlet to use energy products, or it is not easily accessible, and the jurisdiction has to procure compost/mulch instead, can that procurement target be reduced?
Great question. So your procurement target can be met through any of the eligible products outlined in the regulations. So it includes compost, mulch, or those different defined energy products, from renewable gas from anaerobic digestion, and then that electricity from biomass conversion. So the procurement target, whether it's the calculated procurement target based off of your population, or whether it's a reduced procurement target, if your jurisdiction qualifies for that. Either way, you can meet the target through any of those mixes of products. However, just the energy products comes into play is the mechanism for how you will reduce your procurement target. So if you do qualify for a reduced target, this would be determined if the year prior to your compliance year, so let's say for the year of 2022, the energy products you procure in 2021, so your transportation fuel, your electricity, and your gas used for heating that are procured in this year prior to next year's compliance year, those would be used to those would be referenced and used to support a reduced target for the year of 2022, for example. So that's where just those energy products come into play. Hopefully that answers your question.
Hi, Michelle. Can I clarify my question a little bit?
Of course.
Thank you. So my name is Zincy. I work for Zero Waste Sonoma, which is a JPA in Sonoma County. And procurement is a very big question because here in Sonoma County, we are an agricultural community. And so there is already quite a robust market for compost and mulch that is being used by, the farmers and ranchers in the county. And the concern is that our jurisdictions would be competing with these local agricultural communities for the mulch and compost that we're required to procure. And so I'm just wondering if we could get a reduced procurement target because we don't really have renewable gas that's available for procurement. So more than likely we would be procuring mulch and compost. But again, like I said, we don't want to compete with the ag community.
Good question. Scott, would you like to take a stab at it?
Sure. I have introduced myself, Scott Beckner, supervisor that works in these areas. There is no mechanism for reducing a target for other than the one we've been talking about. So competition in your area for products is not something we can take into account in setting alternate targets. That said, like Michelle said, there are a portfolio of products that a jurisdiction could procure, including compost, mulch, all the energy products that are outlined, and CalRecycle and through will be able to offer help in identifying opportunities for procurement if a jurisdiction reaches out and is having trouble finding opportunities. I'm sure there's a lot of industry organizations that are going to be reaching out to jurisdictions to show the products that are out there. And there was one additional thing I wanted to say, but it escapes my mind this second. But yeah, basically it's there's a lot of flexibility within procurement, and it doesn't have to be like Michelle said in her presentation. This is what I wanted to get to. The procurement doesn't have to be of your own waste. It doesn't have to be of products made within your jurisdiction. It doesn't even have to be used within your jurisdiction. So all of that portfolio of flexibility will hopefully help situations like you're in, where there's potentially already a healthy market for some products. In addition, the 1383 will be diverting a substantial amount of new materials from landfills and making new products that aren't already on the market. And so the supply of the materials will be increasing, and hopefully that'll help with the market conditions and as well.
Our next question is from Carlos. He does not have a mic. The question is, how will that notice for targets in May be shared with jurisdictions?
Thanks, Carlos. So the population data of which that will be used to calculate jurisdictions' procurement targets will be released in May. We expect it to, and so when that data is available, CalRecycle will be able to make those calculations, and we'll then be able to notify jurisdictions of their targets. So jurisdictions will be notified through posting on our website and through direct written notification. And I think we'll need to talk a little bit more internally about whether that'll be emails or letters, what that'll all look like, but you will be notified directly by CalRecycle, and we'll be able to reference the website as well to look that up.
And there's nothing precluding anybody in the room right now to get a really good idea of what their procurement target's going to be. We provided as Michelle mentioned, slick procurement calculator that will show you, if you just plug in your population that represents your jurisdiction into it, it'll show equivalence of all the different products, and it has you have the ability to play with the numbers and see different combinations of different products and how that will result in making progress towards your procurement target. And again, it's 0.08 tons per resident, multiplied by the population of your jurisdiction. So don't even need to use the calculator, but I definitely recommend checking out with the calculator. It really helps with visualize what's going to be needed.
Okay, our next question is from Robin Prasker. If you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Hi, Robin with the City of Eureka. I think my question might have been very similar to the question just discussed. It was regarding the calculator and if there was a need to go do that individually or whether you would reach out. So it sounds like both.
Yeah, the newest data, population data that was going to come out mid-year this year was what's going to be used for the official numbers, but you can get a really good idea what the target's going to be right now if you wanted to go to the I think, what's the website, Michelle?
It's the Department of Finance.
So if you Google search Department of Finance California population, I'm sure you could come up pretty quickly. And if you're a county, it is a little bit more complicated. I think you would have to minus out the city populations with your county, and that's one of the services that we're going to be doing when we notify jurisdictions of their official targets. But it actually might include just unincorporated population by default. I'm not sure.
Our next question is from Logan. Logan, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation.
Hi, yes. This is Logan Harvey with the City of Sonoma. My question was answered by Zinsi's response, so mine was the same as Zinsi's. I guess the only question I would add, I guess, since I can think of this one, is would biochar be considered in the compost waste? Would that be considered a product that you could purchase for a procurement, or no?
Not as of the current language in the regs. Right now the regulations are limited to the products that are listed, and to add additional products in the future, we would have to open up the regulations and do a revision. As you probably know, it's quite a process. So at this point, it's limited to the products that are outlined in regs.
Okay, our next question is from Valerie. Valerie, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm Valerie from Butte County. So my question is, in our county and our cities, we have various community garden groups and they do composting. And will the cities be responsible for having written agreement with them for the to make sure that their amounts collected are recorded for the jurisdiction to meet their requirements?
Good question, Valerie. I'll go ahead and try and take a stab at it, and Scott, feel free to jump in. So I think your question kind of borders on a couple of different topics from my understanding. So jurisdictions, so cities, counties, or cities and counties are required to undertake this procurement. So compost, if the product does meet the requirements outlined in the regulations, is an eligible product. And I do encourage you to take a look at that regulatory language. As mentioned earlier, it does specify what types of facilities that compost needs to be produced at. So specific permit types, for example, that where this product would need to be produced. Regarding the use of that compost product, it could be used by the jurisdiction themselves, but it could also be used through what we've defined as a direct service provider relationship. So an entity such as a garden in the, community garden in the area could have a written agreement or contract with the city or county to undertake that procurement on behalf of the city or county. So they could use that eligible product, and this, if outlined in their contracting as such, this could count towards that jurisdiction's procurement targets. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it did. We do have multiple community gardens, and they're rather large, I'm finding. So this is great. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie.
All right, this is Julia. I'm going to ask 2 questions that came in through the SLCP inbox. The first question is from Dana Lawrence with the City of Turlock. Dana just wants to confirm whether CalRecycle will inform jurisdictions of their procurement target every year or every 5 years.
Jurisdictions will be informed annually, I believe, but I can double check the reg text. I believe they will be informed annually. Looks like Scott's nodding his head. But every 5 years is when the jurisdiction's procurement target will be recalculated. So for 2022 through 2027, jurisdictions will be kind of reminded annually of their same procurement target as it's kept current through those 5 years. But then for the next 5 years, it will be recalculated to account for any population changes. So that's where that 5 years comes into play.
Thank you, Michelle. The other question from the SLCP inbox is from Kurt Fuji with Fuji Civil Engineering. Kurt's question is, the slide covering electricity did not mention electric vehicles. Can electricity generated from biogas used for vehicles count toward a jurisdiction's procurement target?
I believe so. Oh,
yeah,
sorry, go for it, Scott.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, electricity procured by a jurisdiction, we don't specify whether it needs to be used in a toaster or a refrigerator or for AC or for electric vehicle. So that is allowable as long as it meets all the requirements from the source and record keeping.
Okay, our next question is from Dan. Dan, if you could please state your affiliation and ask your question, please. Yes.
Great. Yeah, so Dan Noble, I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Compost Producers. We are the California state chapter of the U.S. Composting Council, and we have been in existence for 25 years. So we were very supportive of the regulation, but we're still, we're kind of hung up on this procurement issue relative to, analogous to Cinzy's question about competition with local markets. We're seeing that, well, 2 questions really. One has to do with the, is eligible material only those materials that would have that are otherwise being put into landfills in terms of the percentage above 50% that's already being recycled, or does it include all materials that are coming from an eligible facility?
B. The correct answer is the second piece. We don't.
Okay, that's good news.
Yeah.
Because that means we don't have to try to analyze what was going into the landfill versus what wasn't, right? It's
Correct.
just the total material taken as a package.
Yeah, the regulations were designed to provide certainty to CalRecycle and to stay within our statutory constraints that that the procurement mechanism would result in landfill diversion. Accounting of new landfill diversion is not a requirement to meet our procurement regs.
Well, that's good news. And the other, a corollary to that is, and you kind of answered part of it relative to the community composter or urban garden compost question, and that is, can there be other so-called direct service providers who are not already, say, franchise collection companies? And I guess the answer to that was yes, based on your answer to the previous question about garden composting.
Yeah, I mean, direct service provider language in the regulations is fairly open-ended. It doesn't specify the type of entity that needs to be the direct service provider. I think the critical element is that it's, you know, that entity is doing this on behalf of a jurisdiction and provides the relevant records for reporting to the jurisdiction, and all the other requirements are met.
Okay, great. We'll probably be coming back to CalRecycle just to make sure on that point. But that's great. That's both good news, answers to the question. So thank you, guys.
All right. And we're looking forward to working with organizations like yours and continuing our relationships with developing the markets and trying to get more materials landfilled or diverted from landfills.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Zai Tao. If you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please. Okay, their question is this procurement target part of the SARC reporting?
Thanks for your question, Zai. Reporting will take place through CalRecycle's EAR, our electronic annual reporting. I'm not sure what SARC might stand for.
I think SARC, isn't that a school reporting? I'm not sure. Does anybody else?
It's the state agency one. Kara's going to chime in.
Oh, okay.
Oh, thanks, Kara. Thanks, Ashley.
Sure. Yeah, that is the State Agency Reporting Center, SARC. And state agencies have, as well as the State Agency Buy Recycle campaign system that state agencies report in. State agencies are still subject to their existing procurement requirements, and that's separate and distinct from SB 1383 requirements for jurisdictions, cities and counties, city and county procurement requirements.
Thank you, Kara.
Okay, our next question is from Benjamin. If you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please. Okay, Benjamin's question is, can eligible biomass energy use by direct service providers be counted towards procurement targets?
Thanks for your question, Benjamin. Yes, so as long as all the regulatory requirements are met, that the electricity is being procured from a biomass conversion facility that's meeting all the requirements, and that direct service provider relationship is arranged for that entity to procure on behalf of the city, county, or city and county. As long as those check boxes are marked, that should be able to count towards a jurisdiction's procurement target. It'll just need to make sure it meets those requirements.
Okay. He also has a follow-up question. I wasn't clear on eligibility for target adjustment / lowering. Please describe in detail. Thanks.
Sure, Benjamin. I know it's sometimes a little bit goes in a circle when I feel like I'm trying to explain it. But so a jurisdiction can be eligible to adjust to lower their procurement targets. It's outlined in the regulations in section 18993.1, subsection J, I believe. So do take a look at that text. But what it notes is that if a jurisdiction's calculated procurement target, so their procurement target as calculated as based on their population, if that calculated target exceeds their previous year's procurement of energy products, So let's say for the year of 2022 is our first year of compliance. A jurisdiction will have a calculated procurement target, based on their population. But if at the end of the year, as part of their annual reporting, they'd like to see if they can qualify for an actual reduced procurement target, they would look towards, they would need to ensure that they have records of their previous year's procurement of energy products, so of transportation fuel, electricity, or gas used for heating. So those products, they would need to have records and would need to report to CalRecycle those quantities. So it's those quantities, if they kind of back calculate them using the conversion factors outlined in the regulations, to kind of compare, is our calculated procurement target exceeding our energy products as measured in tons of organic waste, because our procurement target is measured in tons of organic waste. So those energy products in therms and kilowatt hours, you would use those conversion factors to back calculate them to what those would look like in tons of organic waste. And if their calculated target based on their population is exceeding those previous years, procurement quantity, then that's when they would be eligible to lower it to that energy product amount. And hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, and while our calculator doesn't provide that explicit functionality, it could be very useful as a tool to back calculate what that would represent.
Yeah, our next question is from Jennifer Gilbert. If you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Gilbert with the City of Davis. I just have a question, and I apologize, you might have explained it at the beginning of the presentation. I was in another meeting, so I missed it. I know it's been said at other webinars that there is a way for cities and other jurisdictions to obtain the procurement of organic waste products without actually purchasing and using them within the city. We're a real rural area. There's a lot of farms. The city itself might not have a lot of use for compost, but boy, do the farms around us need it. So how does that work? Would the city actually have to purchase the compost, or can we have an agreement with, say, a local composting facility where we say, okay, so let's just assume that, 8,000 tons of your compost that's being bought and purchased for farms, can that count as our procurement? Like, how does that work?
Yeah. So the hurdle for a scenario like that is going to be meeting the requirements for record keeping, including that records that it was utilized on behalf of the jurisdiction, where it was used, etc. So I guess the first part is the clearest cut example of a jurisdiction meeting their procurement target through materials that they didn't procure directly themselves and use in their jurisdiction will be probably direct service provider relationships with entities outside of their jurisdiction. And the language in the regulation is really critical to read there in terms of the requirements, and in particular emphasizing the record keeping, because record keeping will still be the responsibility of the jurisdiction. So any such arrangement for direct service provider, the direct service provider will have to provide all the records that are required for the jurisdiction's compliance evaluation and compliance record. Other than that, it's a fairly flexible, open-ended requirement or option to meet the requirement. So we've heard examples of carbon farming, a jurisdiction doing a direct service provider relationship with a carbon farm to procure and utilize eligible products on their behalf. There's a little bit more specific, more straightforward examples like a hauler in a jurisdiction utilizing fuel in their trucks that's made from eligible organics. And we're also kind of looking forward to seeing what other outside of the box agreements and relationships could be made by jurisdictions to increase the end use of these products.
Okay, thank you very much. So it sounds like if jurisdiction just worked with the surrounding farms, and if the farms were the direct service providers, like they're the ones that are receiving the compost, as long as they maintain their records and submit their receipts, showing how much compost they got, that might fit that criteria. Is that correct?
Can't give rubber stamps on specific scenarios at this point, but as long as all the requirements and regs are met. I'm sorry that we have to keep saying that over and over again, but that's the best we can do at this point. And if you want to have a follow-up conversation, we'd be willing to get on the horn with you and talk it through.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yep.
Okay, our next question is from Ruben Hernandez. Ruben, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you. This is Ruben Hernandez with Marine Sanitary Service here once again. Last week, I heard someone announce publicly during the Environmental Forum of Marine meeting that there are a couple of bills currently moving through the legislature, which one would delay the implementation of SB 1383 and the other one would pause it indefinitely. I understand that's not the case. Obviously from all the workshops that CalRecycle is conducting and all the webinars. And during the meeting, I urge everyone to keep preparing for to comply with the requirements of the SB 1383 regulations. So could you please comment on that and set the record straight? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take that one on since it's not procurement directly related to procurement. So Ruben, thank you for the question and thank you for urging people to continue implementing 1383. But we do know of some bills that have been introduced that would potentially delay the effective dates of implementing the regulations and the enforcement authority over 1383. But right now it's for an undetermined number of years. But our legislative affairs team is engaging with the legislature on all of these bills, so related to recycling, anything organic, which includes this one that you're talking about, so we are well aware of it. It is very early in the legislative session, and we'll continue to analyze the bills to understand the impact to the programs and policies that we have. And so as we know more, we'll for sure let others know. But right now it is super early in the session. But as we've mentioned throughout all these webinars, is we're going to utilize a compliance assistance first approach and really reserve enforcement actions for the egregious offenders in the beginning of 1383. So Ruben, I would agree with you that, folks still need a plan for 1383. The bills, again, are still in the early session, so we don't know the status of if they're going to pass or not. So I would still have people prepare for 1383 because as of now, it is still effective on Jan 1, 2022. So I hope that helps, Ruben. We could have more conversations offline for anyone else who wants to know our legislative process. So thanks again for that question.
Thank you. Thank you for your hard work, guys.
Our next question is from David. David, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself and state your affiliation.
I assume you guys are referring to me. I apologize. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
So my question, our jurisdiction did a pretty robust infrastructure project. We put, I think, $10 million plus into doing a solar panel project for the county. So theoretically, we're not procuring solar or energy for our buildings or our facilities anymore. We're getting that from our solar or our project. So I was wondering, a lot of talk about using this energy equation to potentially lower it. But if we're getting our energy from our solar project, how would that affect our minimizing or reducing our goals?
Yeah, so the alternate target is based on total procurement of energy, regardless of the source or quality or green specs of the energy. So that would be if you're procuring energy from solar, from your own solar panels. Procuring doesn't mean just buy. It could mean make it. It could be taking possession of it in some other way. And for energy, I think that it would be included in your in the documentation that would be necessary to set an alternate target.
All right, I don't understand. So yes, if we are using solar and not procuring energy from the grid, that would count towards reducing our goal. Is that what you're saying? Or it will not count? I mean, I guess I'm confused.
Yeah, there's two things. There's the procuring eligible products to meet your goal, and then there's lowering your goal. The mechanism to lower your goal is based on all procurement of the energy products identified. And so whether you make your own solar or buy electricity from the grid, that doesn't impact the alternate target that you may be able to set through that mechanism. But at the same time, the solar that you're making and utilizing wouldn't count towards meeting that procurement target because it's not an eligible source as item.
So we're getting double hit. We're not getting any benefit from creating our own energy at all, and so our goals because we're producing our own energy and we have no opportunity to produce any greener energy than we're already producing, we get no benefit from that, and it doesn't get counted at all towards our procurement goals.
It doesn't count towards your procurement goals, but the procurement target again is not a specific to each product. Jurisdictions can meet it through any portfolio of any of the eligible products. Your jurisdiction, if you're already procuring energy that is you've invested in that's from solar, the jurisdiction has the other options to procure, including vehicle fuel, gas for heating, compost, and mulch. The reason
again, though, you do understand how that's kind of punishing jurisdictions for doing the right thing already. Like we use natural gas, but we didn't get it from the right facility. We use solar energy, but it doesn't count towards reducing our goals. So jurisdictions are getting no credit for doing environmentally friendly energy reducing activities to start with, which seems counterintuitive to the whole point of the program.
The point of SB 1383 is landfill diversion, and so that's the regulations were developed to ensure additional landfill diversion and utilizing the products that came from landfill diversion. And
again, I heard the statement earlier that your intent was not to have jurisdictions procure energy or procure resources that they weren't already procuring. So that was the whole intent of having a reduce. So if we're not procuring energy because we're using our own solar panels, that should, or seems like it should be something that you guys look into.
Thank you for that comment.
All right, with that, Scott, Michelle, Kristen, thank you so much for helping answer all of the questions. If we did not get to your question today, we will continue to respond to them in the question pane, and we will follow up with you at a later date. So with that, we are going to move into the collections portion, and we will finish that up for the next hour. So thank you all who've asked questions so far. Please continue to do so. Again, right now our topic is collections. So jurisdictions are required to provide an organic waste collection service to all residents and businesses. This is what we refer to as automatically providing service or universal service. The resident or business is automatically provided the service rather than having to subscribe to the service. And the resident or business must participate in that service unless they have been granted a waiver by the jurisdiction. Jurisdictions can comply with the regulations by providing a 3+, a 3, a 2, or a single unsegregated container collection service. They can also use a combination of services. A 3-container service requires a jurisdiction to provide each generator with a green, blue, and gray container. The green container is for the collection of organic waste only. Blue is for the collection of non-organic recyclables that may include paper products, wood and dry lumber, and textiles. And the gray container is for all other non-organic waste. A jurisdiction may provide additional containers or split containers for further source separation. A jurisdiction may allow use of plastic bags or compostable plastics in the green container if the facilities the jurisdiction uses to recover the organic waste provides written notice to the jurisdiction that it can process or remove the plastic bags or compostable plastic. In a two-container collection service, a jurisdiction may either provide a green and a gray container or a gray and a blue container. Under a gray and green container service, the green container is limited to organic waste only, and the gray container allows for the commingling of all other collected waste. Under a blue and gray container service, the blue container is limited to traditional recyclables that may include paper products, wood and dry lumber, and textiles. The gray container is for all other collected waste. In both scenarios, the contents of the gray container must be sent to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. In an unsegregated single container collection service, a jurisdiction may provide a single gray container that allows for the commingling of all waste. The contents of that gray container must be transported to a high diversion organic waste processing facility. CalRecycle will be using RDRS data to identify these facilities, and this information will be provided to jurisdictions. If a high diversion organic waste processing facility has an organic content recovery rate less than the 50% required by 2022 or 75% required by 2025 for 2 consecutive quarterly reporting periods or 3 quarterly reporting periods within 3 years, the facility will not qualify as a high diversion organic waste processing facility. If a jurisdiction is in violation due to its high diversion facility being out of compliance, the jurisdiction will be subject to the enforcement process. In that scenario, the jurisdiction must commit to one of 3 options: bringing the facility back into compliance, using a different high diversion facility, or must implement a 3-container collection service. In a 3- and 2-container collection service, jurisdictions are required to monitor containers for contamination. Contamination monitoring must be done for both residential and commercial routes. A jurisdiction can monitor contamination by conducting either route reviews or waste evaluations. Jurisdictions that choose to conduct route reviews must review all hauler routes annually. Containers may be randomly selected along a hauler route, and cameras can be used to remotely monitor containers. Upon finding contaminants, the jurisdiction must notify the generator of the violation. Note that the regulations do not require a jurisdiction to impose administrative civil penalties on generators who are in violation of the container contaminants requirements. However, the regulations do allow jurisdictions to impose contamination processing fees or penalties for contamination should they wish to do so. Waste evaluations are a facility-based container contamination compliance method. This is an alternative to conducting route reviews, which we just covered. Waste evaluations must be done at least twice per year and must occur in 2 distinct seasons. The evaluations must include samples of each container type, so all container colors, and this is also the same for route reviews. And the samples must be taken from different areas in the jurisdiction that are representative of the jurisdiction's waste stream. The regulations specify the minimum number of samples from all hauler routes that must be included in the waste evaluation from each container type. If the sampled weight of container contaminants exceeds 25% of the measured sample for any container type, the jurisdiction must either notify generators on the sampled routes of the requirement to properly sort, or perform a targeted route review of containers on the sampled routes to determine the sources of contamination, and then notify those generators of their obligation to properly sort. Note that a jurisdiction that is implementing a performance-based source-separated collection service, which is outlined in Article 17, must conduct waste evaluations at least twice per year for the blue and green containers, and once per quarter for the gray container. The regulations standardize container colors. The color scheme is either the lid of the container is the required color, or the body of the container is the required color, and the lid is also the required color, or gray or black. A jurisdiction is not required to replace functional containers that do not comply with the color requirements prior to the end of the useful life of those containers or prior to January 1, 2036, whichever comes first. If a container has minor repairs but remains functional, it does not need to be replaced prior to 2036. In 2022, a jurisdiction must place a label on each new container or lid that is provided to generators. A jurisdiction must either place labels on the body or lid of the container with language, graphic images, or both that indicate the primary acceptable and prohibited materials for that container, or must provide imprinted text or graphic images on the body of the container or the lid that indicate the primary acceptable and prohibited materials for that container. The labeling requirements apply to all containers, such as dumpsters, carts, debris bins, and roll-offs in the residential and commercial sectors. Organic waste generators must comply with local requirements by either subscribing to the organic waste collection service provided by the jurisdiction or self-hauling organic waste in compliance with the regulations. Commercial businesses must provide containers for the collection of organic waste and non-organic recyclables in all areas where disposal containers are provided for customers except restrooms. Businesses must provide collection containers that conform either to the colors of the jurisdiction service or must provide containers that have the required labels. Businesses must prohibit employees from placing organic waste in the wrong container and must periodically inspect containers for contamination. Generators are allowed to manage organic waste on site or use community scale composting activities. Commercial businesses, including multifamily dwellings, must provide or arrange for organic waste collection services for employees, contractors, tenants, and customers. This includes supplying and allowing access to an adequate number, size, and location of containers with the required labels or colors. Businesses must annually provide information to employees, contractors, tenants, and customers about organic waste recovery requirements and properly sorting material, and must provide information to new tenants before or within 14 days upon occupation of the premises. Businesses must provide access to their properties during inspections by the jurisdiction. The regulations allow jurisdictions to grant waivers to generators from the collection requirements. However, jurisdictions do not have to allow any or all of these waivers, and jurisdictions, not haulers, must administer the waivers. Waivers must be reviewed every 5 years by the jurisdiction. A jurisdiction may issue a de minimis waiver to a commercial business if the business is generating a de minimis amount of organic waste. De minimis amounts of waste are less than 20 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that generate 2 cubic yards or more of total solid waste per week. De minimis amounts of waste are also less than 10 gallons per week per applicable container for businesses that generate less than 2 cubic yards of total solid waste per week. A jurisdiction may issue a physical space waiver to a commercial business or property owner if the jurisdiction has evidence demonstrating that the premises lack adequate space for any of the organic waste container configurations. Finally, a jurisdiction may provide a collection frequency waiver, which allows a generator to subscribe to bi-weekly collection of its blue, gray, or both containers if the generator is using a service that requires the placement of all organic waste in the green container. A jurisdiction may issue the collection frequency waiver for the entire jurisdiction, specific areas of the jurisdiction, or an entire neighborhood. A jurisdiction may apply to CalRecycle for a waiver to waive some or all of the collection requirements. A jurisdiction may apply for a low population waiver if the jurisdiction disposed of less than 5,000 tons of solid waste in 2014 and the jurisdiction has a total population of less than 7,500 people. Census tracts located in an unincorporated county with a population density of less than 75 people per square mile also qualify for a low population waiver. Low population waivers must be reevaluated by the department every 5 years. CalRecycle must grant a rural exemption if a jurisdiction qualifies as a rural jurisdiction under AB 1826 and adopts a resolution finding that describes the purpose and need for the exemption. The duration of the rural exemption is until December 31st, 2026. After that, those jurisdictions may apply for the low population waiver if they meet the criteria. CalRecycle may grant an elevation waiver to a jurisdiction if the entire jurisdiction is located at or above an elevation of 4,500 feet. Census tracts located in the unincorporated county that are located at or above 4,500 feet may also apply for an elevation waiver. The census tract may be partially located at that elevation. Elevation waivers exempt generators from the requirement to separate and recover food waste and food soiled paper. High elevation jurisdictions are not required to provide generators with containers, as generators may continue to use their customer or hauler provided containers that fit into their bear boxes. CalRecycle will provide forms, guidance, and training around May or June so that jurisdictions can submit waiver requests starting in September. The regulations establish conditions under which disaster and emergency circumstance waivers to temporarily dispose of organic waste may be granted by a jurisdiction. A jurisdiction is not required to separate or recover organic waste that is removed from homeless encampments and illegal disposal sites. The regulations also outline 3 requirements that must be met to allow a jurisdiction to dispose of quarantined organic waste. And finally, these regulations do not require generators, jurisdictions, or other entities to manage or recover organic waste that federal law explicitly requires to be landfilled, such as solid waste from international flights. Counties and each city, regional agency, and special district that provides solid waste collection services within each county must plan for adequate capacity for recycling organic waste. Each county will lead this effort. The county is responsible for establishing a collaborative approach to planning, collecting organic waste recycling capacity planning information from each jurisdiction, submitting the organic waste recycling capacity report to CalRecycle, identifying any jurisdiction, including itself, that does not have enough organic waste recycling capacity, and informing any jurisdiction that does not have enough capacity the timeline for submitting its implementation schedule to CalRecycle. Capacity planning efforts must include food, green waste, landscape and pruning waste, wood, paper products, digestate, and biosolids. And that concludes my super high-level presentation on the collection requirements. So with that, we will again go into our final Q&A session. So again, please just follow the instructions on this slide for submitting a question. And with that, we will use the rest of our time to get to those questions that you have. So I will hand it over to Sarah and Sarah to facilitate this last session.
Okay, our first question is from Ruben. Ruben, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please. Okay, Ruben's question is, if we decide to do route audits, then we don't have to conduct waste evaluations, correct?
Yes, that is correct. For contamination monitoring, it's either route reviews or waste evaluations. You do not have to do both. It is one or the other.
And the only caveat to that is if a jurisdiction selects to do a performance-based collection service, then waste evaluations are the only option.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't mute myself on time.
Our next question is from Logan. Logan, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation. So Logan's question is, how is adequate size determined by a multi-family dwelling?
Yeah, can we give Logan just a second? Logan, are you able to unmute yourself?
I finally unmuted. Sorry. It's a struggle sometimes on these things. It's Logan Harvey, City of Sonoma. My question, there was a point made that multifamily dwelling unit would have to have an adequate size service for compost or for organics processing. So I'm just wondering how adequate size is defined. So for example, would a 10 unit apartment building with half a yard of compost available be adequate? How would that metric be determined?
That's a great question, Logan. And I think, working with the hauler to determine what's adequate is definitely going to be dependent upon that particular multifamily. I mean, I think that the key that we're after is that you want to make sure that there's enough green container, blue container service such that those multifamily residents have enough capacity so that they're not having to throw away organic material into the trash container. So there's no set metric in the regulation, but again, that's gonna, I think you should have some pretty good metrics by now, what's reasonable for a multifamily dwelling, depending on the number of residents in that dwelling, and work with your hauler. And then with, as Julia noted, with the contamination monitoring, if you're having a lot of contamination of the gray container, the trash container, that could be an indication that there's not enough either green container or blue container capacity if you have a 3-container system. Does that help, Logan?
Yeah, that helps a certain amount. I guess my question would still be, is CalRecycle kind of operating from it when you see it perspective with regards to enforcement on adequacy? And then for me, contamination concerns would predominantly be in the blue and green containers, especially with the green, just because residents aren't aware yet of those rules. They're not as aware as they are with recycling, and we already see a lot of contamination in the recycling bin.
Sure. So in the first question, if Alan is available, happy to have him join to talk about compliance evaluations. On the second part of your question, so the regulations do require for container contamination minimization monitoring that if you have a 3-container system, all 3 containers need to be monitored. I think, in Sonoma, you're absolutely right that likely it's more of a problem in those other 2 containers than in the gray container, but the regulations do require also monitoring the gray container to ensure that organic waste generators are not disposing of organic waste in the trash container. Alan?
Yeah, so Logan, from what I'm hearing, and I cut the tail end of that, so we're discussing about the adequacy of the availability to have that within there for the capturing of that. So the department is still in the process of developing the process of performing our compliance evaluations. But what I can speak to is how we determine today, and when we're evaluating particular locations, businesses, multifamily locations, we're evaluating how the program is working. So that's essentially during our compliance evaluation, we will be determining a jurisdiction's process and how they're implementing their program, and determining whether or not that their program that they have implemented is adequate in that sense. So if we were to visit a particular business, or in this case, for this particular instance, if we're looking at a business and we see a lot of organic material within the trash container, not at that one particular site, but at multiple sites across during our compliance evaluation. Upon evaluating that particular jurisdiction, there would be something that would be a cause for a red flag, and that would be looked at as there's a gap in the jurisdiction's implementation of their program. So we're not looking at it per se for any one particular, but we're looking holistically as a whole of how the jurisdiction is implementing a program within their jurisdiction to implement the 1383 regulations. If that helps generally grand scheme answer your question, Logan.
So I guess what I'm hearing is that there's not going to be, right now, there's no plans for CalRecycle to be directly looking at multifamily dwelling units and saying, hey, you only have a 24-gallon bin for this or a cart for this this 20-unit multifamily, and that's not adequate. What you're really going to be doing is looking at the garbage and seeing if there's food waste in there. Generally, if there's food waste issues or there's significant amounts of food waste in garbages throughout the town or jurisdiction, and then determining whether the program is adequate holistically.
Correct. So, and that's the main thing with any compliance evaluation, and that's what's occurring today during my team's evaluations of SHRI, the MCR, and the MORE program. We're evaluating whether or not the jurisdiction is implementing a program. We're not going after any specific nuances or instances, but we're ensuring that the program is working and the jurisdiction has a program in place to implement the regulations, in this case 1383.
Okay, so at least to start, it's going to be really high level, and it might get more nuanced as time goes on.
We don't have any specifics with regards to that yet detailed at this point, but from what I can tell you from an enforcement standpoint, the department will be evaluating jurisdictions' implementation efforts for 1383.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, our next question is from Robin Prasker. If you could please state your affiliation, ask your question, please.
Hi, Robin with the City of Eureka, and I was hoping to circle back to the collection frequency waivers. I just didn't quite follow what would make one eligible for that waiver.
Sure. So I can repeat kind of what I said and see if that answers your question. So a jurisdiction may authorize a generator to subscribe to bi-weekly collection of its blue, gray, or both containers if the generator is using a service that requires the placement of all organic waste in the green container, with the exception of organic waste that's specifically allowed for collection in the blue container, like in a 3-container collection service, so paper and cardboard. However, prior to authorizing that particular waiver, the jurisdiction or its authorized hauler must demonstrate to the local enforcement agency that the collection frequency waiver would not cause that receiving solid waste facility or operation to be in violation of applicable state minimum standards. Do you have follow-up? Did that make sense?
Yeah, I think I might be getting tripped up over the term of the blue and gray container definitions. So in this case, is this generator still composting, or they're not composting at all? I'm not following that part.
Yeah, so the generator is still required to be to collect and recycle their green waste and their food waste in a green bin, depending on what service they have. So that would still be weekly collection service that would be required. But in a 3-container collection service, for example, where food and yard waste is in the green container, that blue container waste and the gray container waste could be subject to bi-weekly collection because all of that food and green waste is in the green container. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see. So this is just specific to the frequency of composting. It doesn't mean that they don't have to compost. It just means that the frequency in which the containers are being emptied is what differs from the regulation.
Yeah, for the blue and for the gray. So they can be bi-weekly. That green has to be weekly. So this is specific to the gray and the blue container waste.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, and Robin, so for a lot of jurisdictions currently, what we call the green container or the organic container is currently collected, maybe collected every 2 weeks. So the regulations require that green container be collected every week now. But what the regulations allow for is if a jurisdiction was collecting trash every week, there's a provision now to switch to go with every other week trash container collection and every week that green container collection, and same thing with the blue. So it's just allowing some flexibility to reduce the number of collection stops and, you know, better, more efficiently utilize the existing collection vehicles that you have. So the regulations lay out what's needed to be able to make changes in the frequency for either that trash container or that recycling container if it's needed.
And this is Julia. So I'm going to quickly ask 2 questions from the SLCP inbox before we go back to the GoToWebinar questions. So this first question is from Zinzi, and I know she's on here, so hopefully we can unmute her. So her question, she received a question from a commercial generator, a construction company. They put all their tree trimmings, wood pallets, and other landscape debris through a chipper and apply the chips as ground cover on their own land. Would they be compliant with the organic waste diversion requirements of 1383? Yeah, so that's Zinzi's question. And then Zinzi, if we have you unmuted, feel free to add any context to that question that you need.
Sure, yeah, and I just wanted to mention that this is a construction company. They do contracts, so most of their staff are out in the field, and I believe they said they only have about 7 people on site every day, so it's not a lot of food waste that they're generating. So most of it is landscaping that they are already, you know, chipping. So would they be considered compliant?
So, Zinzi, the jurisdiction is the one that determines the amount of service that's needed. So the jurisdiction could issue a de minimis waiver to that commercial business, depending upon what their situation is. So, you know, for example, if they don't have any material that would go into the blue recycling container, or if all of that kind of depends on what the collection service is for that one. If all of that construction waste is being collected, and then there's another type of service, maybe like separate food waste collection is determined to be de minimis. So again, it's up to the jurisdiction to issue a waiver and make that determination on whether or not to issue a de minimis waiver to a commercial business. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
All right, and so really quickly, the next question is from Christina Doug. She's with Athens Services. Christina's question is, what is the difference between a performance-based program versus a 3-container program? And so I can start trying to answer that question. So the performance-based collection service is outlined in Article 17. So one of the key differences is the jurisdiction must be providing the service to no less than 90% of businesses and 90% of residents. So that is a requirement for the performance-based service. One of the differences also with just a regular 3-container service, the jurisdiction must conduct waste evaluations. However, the waste evaluations, they have to monitor the gray container more frequently than a jurisdiction that's just doing the standard approach is what we call it. And then those jurisdictions, if they're able to meet all of the requirements of the performance-based service, they do have some compliance exceptions. So they have a little bit less education and outreach requirements, some less record-keeping requirements, but they do still have to comply with the requirements for edible food recovery, for capacity planning, and for other pieces of the regulations, such as procurement, for example. So hopefully that answers your question.
Ashley's going to say it, the new tool. Go ahead, Ashley.
Yep. So Karen, I was thinking, because we are checking our emails while we're doing this webinar, and I was going to put it on a listserv announcement next week, but because we have more tools that we're releasing. But we did just post live a standard collection service versus the performance-based collection service document So this document is actually a matrix that compares Article 3 versus Article 17. So that is on our collections webpage. Since you guys are listening live, I'll put it in the chat feature where you could find it. But again, I will mention it in a listserv next week with all of our other tools and documents that we're getting out right now.
That's excellent timing.
Our next question is from Paul. Paul, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself and state your affiliation and ask your question.
Great, thank you. Paul Freund with the Tehama County Solid Waste Management Agency. We're a Joint Powers Authority in Tehama County. In regards to the container labeling requirements, because we meet the rural exemption definition, then would we also, we'll back up a little. In the regulations, it says the label would be placed on each new container or lid provided to generators. So does that mean just only new containers that our haulers are providing to the generators will have to have those labels? They don't need to go out and stick labels on every single container that's out in the community. And then on top of that is then anytime a new resident or somebody gets a new recycling cart or a new trash cart or a new yard waste cart for residents, then they would have to have that label on there.
Correct. Only new.
Only new. Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect. And then on top of that, the requirements for the or organic waste generators for in their businesses where the disposal containers are provided. Again, we meet the rural exemption. We're going to apply for that. Once that goes into effect, then those organic waste generators, obviously, they won't have a collection program, so they won't be required to provide collection containers for organic waste until we are required to meet those requirements.
Yeah, Paul, that's correct. So if the jurisdiction in this case has the rural exemption, all of the generators within that jurisdiction also are exempted. And I think, why I was wanting you to talk about this verbally is the jurisdiction that's exempt, in this case, the rural exemption, goes until the end of December 31st, 2026. That allows a jurisdiction not to be subject to any of the Article 3 requirements, as well as the generators that are located in that. So they don't have to provide internal collection containers, right? Because as you said, they don't have collection service. There are also a number of other requirements that you wouldn't be needing to do. For example, in Article 4, the first requirement is to educate generators on the collection services that are available. So obviously you don't have a collection service, so you wouldn't be doing that. So our team would be happy, Paul, to meet with you and go over all of the things that you wouldn't have to do. Additionally, for jurisdictions that are subject to the rural exemption through 2026, in probably early to mid 2026, Tehama County would also want to be looking at if they meet the low population waiver. In that case, many of the requirements, except for things like organic waste product procurement, would continue to be waived going forward, and you wouldn't have to adhere to those. So we have some information we could provide to you. We could kind of go through all of those scenarios. Did that help, Paul?
Yeah, definitely. This is what we discussed last week with our LAMD representative. And we're fortunate to be a part of the Rural County Representative California, ESJPA, which has been advocating on behalf of rural counties, especially in regard to SB 1383. I think we're also awaiting some tools from CalRecycle as well to test out some record keeping stuff. So we'll be looking forward to testing those.
Yeah, thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate you guys being a tester of those tools. And also, ESJPA has provided some excellent planning tools for the rural counties and rural cities to help you with implementation. I know you've availed yourselves to those. So I think all those tools are really helpful in helping our rural communities prepare. And again, we are specifically talking about organic waste requirements. Just want to reiterate that there's nothing in the regulations that allow a jurisdiction to be waived from the edible food recovery requirements. So I just want to put a plug in for edible food. Thanks.
Okay, our next question is from Jennifer Claiborne. Jennifer, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Sure, Jennifer Claiborne, Sacramento County. We are digging deep into our de minimis waiver development. We're starting the 20-gallon waiver evaluation coming this May. So we are very interested to kind of hear if CalRecycle, if they have any criteria or recommendations on how our inspectors, when they're in the field, how they find or how they determine the 20 gallons produced or less per week when they're just there, you know, at a one shot. It could be before trash day, after trash day. And so that evaluation could change depending on that. And so I know for ourselves, we're developing a list of criteria that our inspector would be kind of checking off, but it'd be really helpful if CalRecycle came up with something standard that all of the local jurisdictions could utilize.
Hey, Jennifer, thanks for your suggestion. We'll give some thought to that. You know, because the de minimis waivers are up to the jurisdiction, our focus has been more on peer matching with other jurisdictions that are already implementing something similar. So for example, Stop Waste. So I think that would be our first place. And I'm not sure if you've already talked to folks at Stop Waste. If you haven't, we'd like to make an introduction to them.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. And thanks for digging in, Jennifer. I know you guys are doing an awful lot of work right now. Appreciate it.
Our next question is from Robin. Robin, you are now unmuted. Please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation.
Robin with City of Eureka, and might have got my question answered after I asked it. There was a slide that had mentioned either having curbside or self-haul available. I think it was for commercial generators, and I just wasn't sure if there was a way in which only self-haul services would be allowed, but I think that 90% reference I've been hearing might be the answer to that. So I was just trying to get clarification on self-haul versus curbside.
Sure. And Robin, I think it would be great if we could have a follow-up conversation with you and the LAM liaisons and us to talk through your particular situation. So the regulations do require that jurisdictions provide collection services. So that's that 3, 2, or 1, or any combination. So that's kind of the fundamental overarching aspect of it. The regulations also allow jurisdictions to be eligible for rural exemption, low population waivers, or elevation waivers. In those situations, a jurisdiction is not subject to providing collection services during that time frame for organic waste. So while and then additionally, the regulations do allow for a jurisdiction to issue a de minimis waiver to a commercial business that is falling below those particular levels. So it'd be great if we could have a follow-up conversation and dig more into your situation and provide additional feedback and guidance.
Okay, our next question is from Ruben. Ruben, if you could please unmute, state your affiliation, and ask your question, please.
Yeah, hi, this is Ruben Hernandez with Marine Sanitary Service again. We have multiple bin services ranging from 1-yard bin to 38-yard roll-up bins. And I'm just wondering if the color container requirements apply to bins as well. And if it does, then would that apply for temporary debris boxes, temporary debris bins, and roll-up bins as well? And what color would they need to be? Thank you.
Julia, did you want to start or do you want me to?
Sure, I can start. Yeah, so the color requirements apply to bins and carts, anything that's provided by the jurisdiction or its designee, the hauler, to organic waste generators, so both. And the color for temporary debris bins and roll-offs, for example, it would depend on what is being collected in that bin. So if it's a mix of everything and it's a one container service, then it would have to be gray. And also the lid versus the container color requirements apply. So it could be the lid or the bin, but if there is no lid, then it would have to be the container. So it just depends what's being collected in that container in terms of what color the container is required to be. And I'll let Kara chime in.
Sure, and I think the thing that I would like to add, because the type of containers that you're talking about probably are going to be functional for a long time. So again, when we talk about the container color requirements, it is either when that functional container is no longer able to be used, for example, and it has to be replaced, or by January 1, 2036. So Ruben, it's entirely possible that many of the containers that you're talking about will not have to be the specified color until or if they need to be replaced, or it's January 1, 2036. So that's something to keep in mind, and that should give you a lot of time to plan for, the types of color requirements that you might need for these larger metal types of bins that do tend to last for quite some time. Does that help, Ruben?
Yes, it does. I just have another follow-up question on specifically temporary debris boxes that customers rent for general debris, or for example for concrete or materials like that will not go to the landfill. We take it to our MRF, and then the materials get separated and diverted. So I'm just wondering what the colors of those bins would be. Their boxes, for example.
Yeah, it kind of sounds, well, it kind of sounds like it's a single container collection service. And in that case, that would be gray or any shade of gray, black, etc. So it's, but I'm not entirely sure with your situation. So if it's just a single container, that mixed container of construction debris that goes to that facility for processing, then that could be the color. If you had a 2-container collection, so there was an actual container for real trash, and then the mixed C and D, then likely that color would be blue, possibly. But again, it depends, or it could be green, depends on how you're defining that 2-container collection service. So kind of depends, Ruben.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Our next question is from David. David, please unmute yourself to ask your question and state your affiliation.
David Garcia, Nevada County Department of Public Works. I've already had some conversations with Kara's team, but I was hoping for clarification on the legislation seems to specifically mandate that jurisdictions provide collection service, but not that we require everyone to use our particular collection service. It allows for self-haul. It has different requirements for enforcement on residential customers, etc. So I was hoping that somebody, maybe Kara, could provide a little bit of information about that. We're still waiting for clarification on that specific topic.
Yeah, David, thanks so much for your question. Your particular questions are still under review by the department. I hope that we'll have some feedback for your particular situation soon. Just to provide big picture clarity and without diving into your particular situation, the regulations do require that jurisdictions provide collection services, and it's any variety. It's that single, 2 or 3 container collection service or any combination. Generators are required to either participate in that service or self-haul. As I mentioned, the regulations allow for commercial de minimis waivers to be issued by the jurisdiction. As far as your particular situation, again, I do hope that we'll have some feedback to you very, very soon, and I appreciate your patience.
Yeah, and I only bring it up because I don't know that our situation is unique, and I imagine that other jurisdictions may have similar questions regarding providing versus mandating collection for residential customers.
Yeah, agreed. And I think when we've worked through this one, the issues and situations that you raised, I think you're right. There are many other jurisdictions, particularly unincorporated counties, that will have similar situations. So I do expect that whatever guidance we come up with your situation will be applicable to many others.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, David. And again, I appreciate your patience.
Okay, our next question is from Jennifer Claiborne. Jennifer, if you could please state your affiliation and ask your question, please.
Jennifer Claiborne, Sacramento County. Back to the de minimis waiver. Sorry to continue to focus on that, but we understand from the regulation that it states that a jurisdiction or a generator may demonstrate they're producing less than 20 gallons of organic waste per week. And my question is there any clarity or recommendation on what a generator may provide as demonstrating that they produce less than 20 gallons? We're leaning towards a de minimis waiver where a generator will self-report that information, but we want to ensure that we're collecting the right information or documents from them to provide CalRecycle's requirements of demonstrating.
Jennifer, those are really good questions. I think Alan jumped on as well, because I think Alan's going to talk a little bit about the verification aspect of the regulations with respect to Article 14. So I'll let Alan go ahead and jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Kara. So Jennifer, great questions. You know, as what you're asking here in the questions regarding the de minimis, jurisdictions are allowed to issue de minimis waivers for commercial businesses who produce less than 20 gallons. I think earlier on, your initial question was, how are you verifying that on site? You're doing the inspections, maybe just got picked up yesterday, so there's an empty bin, or it's a full bin and it's getting picked up tomorrow. You know, from my standpoint, and when my staff is evaluating jurisdictions, and we ran into this in some instances for jurisdictions who are allowing exemptions for their 1826 program, their MORE program. And you know, really when we're evaluating and we're assessing a lot of the commercial businesses with regards to the current diversion mandates, we always, you know, we don't always, but we prefer to evaluate contents of bins when there's actual contents in there. So in your instance, and I think your initial question, you don't really have a lot of value when your inspections are going out there and they're verifying whether or not there's 20 gallons in there when there is, you know, the bin is 10% full. So you're not getting really the full contents of a 4 cubic yard container. Specifically with regards to this specific question there, with any check boxes or ensuring that the generator, they're self-reporting that they are demonstrating that they're producing. The department doesn't really have a checklist to go through. You know, that's all going to be built around a jurisdiction's inspection and enforcement program that they're outlining within to implement their inspection and enforcement program upon those. So, you know, as Kara was stating, and within Julia's presentation, the de minimis waivers, they can be issued. It's up to the jurisdiction also, and it's the jurisdiction's responsibility to ensure that the waivers that are granted once, you know, from 5 years upon the issuance of that, to ensure that that it's appropriate, that waiver meets that definition, in this case, the 20 gallons. You know, and I think that's some of the other conversations that we can continually have offline with regards to that. So it's very case by case specific. But I guess generally, with the question that you posed here, it's up to the jurisdiction to build their inspection and enforcement program to ensure that their commercial businesses are, one, they're meeting their definition of the de minimis, and also two, that it's appropriate for that particular business and that they are generating 20 gallons. When I see the 20 gallons, I'm thinking of the 20-gallon tub that I buy at Target for storing things. But that's kind of just my visual. But really, it's up to the jurisdiction to implement that program, and then also ensure that through inspections within 5 years of the issuance of the waivers that it is appropriate for that particular business.
Yeah, and I think, Alan, that's great. Thanks. Just to add on one other thought, I think, Jennifer, for your situation, if the generator is requesting a waiver, having that generator describe why they have less than 20 gallons, right? We always use the car dealership as our example. A car dealership has no on-site kitchen, food facility. The only food waste, for example, that's generated is a minimal amount from our employees' lunches, all of our landscaping. We don't have any landscaping, or maybe it's all taken off site. So I think, having a description from the generator on why they are requesting the waiver and the basis for it, I think is a great first step. And then, as Alan mentioned, that verification happening. And I think over time, and I think jurisdictions are already seeing this, certain types of businesses just don't generate certain types of organic waste. So I think you're going to also start building up some truthing there. If you have a certain type of generator that's requested a waiver, you're going to have a good sense for some of them that, yeah, that's a kind of business that doesn't have it. And that verification, should be pretty straightforward. Does that help, Jennifer? I know you're looking more from us, more specifics, but as Alan mentioned, a lot of this is up to the jurisdictions to design their issued waiver program.
No, that makes a lot of sense. We just want to avoid anything in the future being questioned on why we approve certain waivers
Sure.
when we're developing these evaluation tools.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful as a direction. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and then just to play along that, if CalRecycle were to conduct a compliance evaluation, the regulations are set up that we would communicate to you what that gap is. So it's not like you immediately go to penalties because there's an issue. So this is a great example, as Alan mentioned, if we were doing a compliance evaluation and we had rationale to identify that there was a gap, we would communicate that, and then there would be time for you to correct that gap. And Alan, is there anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, no, that's correct. As Kara stated, the 1383 regulations detail out and outline how the department's enforcement action and the process, and there are timelines built into the department's enforcement process where there's communication that's occurring from the department to the jurisdictions. Essentially, there's no surprises. Everything will be communicated out. There's times that are built in there with the NOV, the notice of violations, that jurisdictions will have time to address those violations upon that. So Kara's absolutely correct, outlined within the regulations is the department's enforcement process.
Thanks. And I'm not necessarily as concerned about the jurisdiction as I am about flip-flopping potentially on businesses who really rely on whether they receive these waivers or not. But thank you. That helps give us some direction.
All right, so we are approaching noon, and so our last question is going to come from Edgar. Edgar, you asked a question about performance versus the standard 3-container collection service, and you said the way that this question was answered, it sounds as though commercial and residential customers do not need to partake in organics collection if a jurisdiction offers a 3-container collection service. So I will clarify my response to that, and you're also self-muted if you would like to add anything to your question. So just to start off, so a performance-based service versus a standard 3-container collection service, in both options, the jurisdiction is required to provide an organic waste collection service, so a 3-container service for performance-based, to all organic waste generators, residential and commercial. The residential and commercial organic waste generators must participate in that service. And for performance-based, what is key is 90% of residential and 90% of commercial customers have to be participating in that service. If it's 88%, then the jurisdiction cannot be implementing a performance-based service, which essentially means they won't have the compliance exceptions. So slightly less record keeping, slightly less education outreach, and we'll have to do the standard performance collection service. So hopefully that helps provide clarity. You are unmuted on our end if you do have a follow-up question. All right, so if you don't have follow-up, Edgar, hopefully we answered your question for you, and that will be our last question for today. So thank you all so much. I will hand it over to Ashley to close it out for us.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Kara, Julie, and Alan, for answering some collection questions. Again, for anything that we didn't get to, we will be tracking these. So you will be receiving a response from us or a phone call from us to talk about your situation further. As I mentioned earlier, please sign up for the listserv, as we'll be announcing hopefully quite a bit of tools next week or the week after. You already heard there is an Article 3 versus Article 17 matrix online. Also for facilities, we do have some sampling guidelines that just went up today. But again, I will list them next week or the week after in a listserv message with links to everything. So thank you guys all for participating in our last regional webinar. We're open to feedback as you'd like to provide. So please email the SLCP inbox if you have anything further or need to provide any comments or concerns or questions. And have a great day, everyone. Thanks again.